In the quiet town of Deadwood Ridge, a small, dusty patch of the western American frontier, a group of hardened bikers rolls into town with one thing on their minds: taking over. But they aren't prepared for the daughter of a rancher, a woman whose calm demeanor masks deadly skills learned through years of military service. When these bikers challenge her, they have no idea they're about to meet their match, and that her quiet life is about to bring their entire corrupt empire crashing to the ground. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because tomorrow we have a special story for you. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the flat plains that surrounded Deadwood Ridge. A slow breeze stirred the dust on the main street as the town settled into its usual evening routine. Quiet, peaceful, but always on the edge. It was a place where people came to escape, to start over, or sometimes just to disappear. For most, life here was simple. But for Eliza Hayes, it was far from it. Eliza was the daughter of the town's oldest rancher, Bill Hayes. Her family's ranch, spread out for miles on the outskirts of town, was a symbol of the land's rugged, untamed spirit. Bill was known for his no-nonsense attitude, and many who lived in Deadwood Ridge respected him or feared him, depending on who you asked. But Eliza, his only child, was different. She had the same quiet strength as her father, but there was something else about her, a steel edge that ran deeper than most knew. Eliza had once served in the military, a fact few outside of her closest circle knew. Her skills were sharp, her reflexes honed, her mind as precise as a well-oiled machine. She had returned to Deadwood Ridge a few years ago, seeking peace after years of service. But peace was something that had never come easily for her. On this particular evening, as the last light of day dipped below the horizon, the sound of roaring engines shattered the town's calm. A convoy of motorcycles, black and chrome gleaming under the setting sun, rolled into Deadwood Ridge like a storm gathering on the horizon. At the lead of the pack was a man named Vince "Viper" Moretti, the leader of a notorious biker gang known as the Black Riders. They had been terrorizing the surrounding counties for months now, leaving a trail of violence, corruption, and fear in their wake. And Deadwood Ridge, with its small-town charm and lack of a strong law enforcement presence, was their next target. Vince and his gang had plans to take over the town. They'd already begun to intimidate local businesses, forcing protection money from anyone who dared to resist. But they hadn't accounted for one thing: Eliza Hayes. As the bikers rolled into town, the sound of their engines reverberated through the dusty streets. People glanced nervously out of windows, and shop owners quickly locked their doors. But Eliza wasn't the type to hide. She stood outside her father's ranch, watching them approach. She knew who they were, and she knew exactly what they were capable of. But she also knew something they didn't. They had no idea who they were messing with. Vince Moretti was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He had spent years building his criminal empire, and Deadwood Ridge was just another piece in the puzzle. When he spotted Eliza standing on the porch of the ranch, his eyes narrowed. She was striking, with dark hair that hung loose around her shoulders and eyes that seemed to pierce through the gathering dust. There was something about her that immediately piqued his interest. He pulled his bike to a stop in front of the ranch, kicking up a cloud of dirt as he dismounted. His gang followed suit, surrounding the area like vultures circling prey. "Well, well," Vince said, flashing a sly grin. "A rancher's daughter. Thought we'd come and see if we can do business with your old man." Eliza didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands relaxed at her sides, but her mind was already working, calculating. There was a certain weight to Vince's words, a sense of arrogance that told her exactly what kind of man he was. But it didn't scare her. She had seen far worse in her time, and if this was going to be a fight, then it was one she was ready for. "My father's not here," she replied coolly, "but you can leave a message." Vince chuckled darkly, taking a step closer. "I don't think you understand, sweetheart. This is our town now. We're in charge. And we're not in the business of leaving messages." Eliza's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew this wasn't just about intimidation anymore. These bikers weren't interested in business. They were here to make a statement. And she was going to make one of her own. Vince leaned in, close enough that she could smell the leather of his jacket, the scent of gasoline and sweat. He was testing her, trying to see if he could break her. But he was underestimating her, and it was a mistake he was about to regret. "You're making a mistake," Eliza said softly, her voice carrying a calm that didn't match the storm raging inside her. "You should turn around and leave. Now, or this won't end the way you think it will." Vince's smirk faltered, just for a moment. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not by a woman, but he wasn't going to back down. He had a reputation to uphold. "Well, I guess we'll see how this plays out," he said, stepping back. "Boys, show her what happens when people don't listen." The rest of the gang moved in, their hands already on their weapons, their eyes filled with a dangerous gleam. But Eliza wasn't waiting for them to make their move. In one fluid motion, she drew a knife from her belt and advanced on the closest biker. The cold steel gleamed under the setting sun as she moved with a precision that would have taken most people years to perfect. Vince didn't have time to react before Eliza's blade was at his throat. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy silence in its wake, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and the quiet thrum of motorcycles idling. The bikers froze, their eyes wide in disbelief as Eliza's blade pressed lightly against Vince Moretti's throat. It was a position that could have ended any fight in a heartbeat, but that wasn't what Eliza was about. She didn't want to kill him. Not yet. What she wanted was to send a message. Vince's pulse quickened beneath the cold steel, his hands twitching at his sides. He wasn't used to being the one who was cornered. He had built his empire by instilling fear in others, but now the tables had turned. The rancher's daughter wasn't some helpless town girl. She was a force, and the realization hit him hard, the truth settling in with the weight of 1,000 regrets. "You think you're the first tough guy I've met?" Eliza said, her voice low and controlled, like the calm before a storm. "I've dealt with worse than you and your gang. You should have stayed out of Deadwood Ridge." Vince's lips curled into a sneer, but his mind raced. He had underestimated her. Badly. But he wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. His eyes flicked to his men, silently giving them the signal to prepare. But they didn't move. They were too stunned, too uncertain. None of them expected this kind of fight. Most of them had only heard the rumors about Eliza's past, the stories of her military training, the whispers of her abilities. But standing here, face to face with the quiet, deadly force that was Eliza Hayes, they realized the rumors were true. Vince swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing beneath the knife. His mind worked quickly, calculating his next move. He was a man who thrived on control, and right now, control was slipping through his fingers. "You're making a big mistake, sweetheart," Vince finally said, his voice a little shakier than he intended. "You don't know what you're up against. We own this town now. You can't fight us all." Eliza didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She could hear the tremor in his voice, the uncertainty, and she knew exactly what to do with it. "You don't own anything here," she said quietly. "Not this town, not its people, not even your own life if you keep pushing." She leaned in closer, her face inches from his, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of fear in Vince's eyes. A flicker he quickly buried. Her knife pressed just a little harder against his skin, just enough to remind him of what could happen if he didn't listen. The gang watched in a mixture of awe and hesitation, the fear slowly creeping into their expressions. It was clear that the rancher's daughter wasn't just a symbol of the town's rugged past. She was its protector, a woman who had trained for this, who was now using everything she had to defend her home. And that was something they didn't know how to fight. Vince's pride warred with the instinct to retreat, but as much as he hated to admit it, he knew she had him. His mind raced, and his gaze flicked to his men again. But he didn't dare give another signal. This wasn't a fight that could be solved with brute force. Not yet. He needed to figure out how to regain control, how to take her down without losing face in front of his men. "All right," Vince finally spat, his voice a low growl. "We'll leave. For now." Eliza didn't lower the knife. She studied him, watching for any hint of a trap, any sign that he wasn't truly backing off. "You better mean it," she warned, her voice cold, like steel wrapped in velvet. "I don't give second chances. Leave now, or I'll make sure you regret it." Vince held her gaze for a long moment, and for the briefest of seconds, something shifted in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was understanding, a recognition of who he was really up against. Finally, he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "We'll go," he muttered, his voice laced with venom. "But you haven't seen the last of us. You're gonna regret this, sweetheart. We don't forget slights like this." With that, he signaled to his gang, and one by one, the bikers started their engines, the growl of their motorcycles breaking the tension in the air. But even as they began to pull away, there was a sense of finality in the air. The bikers had been warned, but they weren't gone for good, and Eliza knew it. As the last of them disappeared from view, Eliza exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She lowered the knife, but her hand still trembled slightly. Not from fear, never fear, but from the adrenaline that surged through her, the sharpness of the moment, the clarity that came with knowing she had just put a serious dent in the plans of a dangerous criminal empire. But she couldn't let her guard down. Not yet. She turned back toward the ranch, her thoughts already racing. Vince and his gang would be back. They always came back. And when they did, she would be ready. She wasn't just defending her family or her town. She was defending everything she believed in. Eliza's fingers tightened around the knife's hilt. There was no going back now. The evening air was cool, and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees was the only sound that broke the silence after the bikers had retreated. Eliza stood in the middle of the porch, the blade still in her hand, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She'd won the first round, but she knew the battle wasn't over. Vince Moretti wasn't the type to just let something like that slide, especially when his ego had been bruised. With a final glance toward the road where the Black Riders had disappeared, Eliza slowly sheathed her knife. She could still feel the hum of tension in her muscles, the adrenaline that had surged through her veins just moments ago now ebbing away, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion. Her heart was still racing, her mind buzzing with calculations, strategies, and contingencies. She had been trained to think like this, to react like this. Every movement, every decision had been drilled into her during her time in the military. It wasn't just about combat. It was about control, discipline, the ability to see what others couldn't. And right now, she saw the danger coming, clearly, as if it were written in the dust of the road. Eliza turned back toward the ranch house, her boots kicking up the dry earth beneath her as she walked toward the door. Inside, the warm light from the kitchen flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Her father, Bill Hayes, was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in his hands. He didn't look up as she entered, but Eliza could see the lines of worry etched into his face, even in the soft light. "You did good out there," he said quietly, his voice low and rough, the kind of voice that carried the weight of years of hard work and harder choices. Eliza nodded but didn't say anything. Her father didn't need her to speak. He knew her well enough to understand the thoughts racing through her mind. Bill Hayes had never been the type to give advice or offer words of wisdom, but there was a strength in his silence. And in that silence, Eliza found her own resolve. "You're thinking about what comes next," her father said after a beat, his eyes finally meeting hers. Eliza sighed, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table. "They'll be back," she said flatly. "And next time, they won't be as willing to walk away." Bill set his coffee cup down with a soft clink and leaned back in his chair. "Then we'll be ready. You don't have to do this alone, Eliza." She met his gaze then, her expression hardening. "I know, but this is my fight. I'm not letting them take this place." Her father didn't argue, though his concern was still palpable. He'd seen the toll her military service had taken on her, the way it had changed her. But he also knew that Eliza wasn't the kind of woman to back down from a fight, no matter how difficult. And that quality, more than anything else, was what made her dangerous. As Eliza moved to leave the room, her thoughts swirled. She had known this day would come, the moment when Deadwood Ridge would no longer be the quiet, peaceful town it had once been. There had always been whispers of the Black Riders making their way toward the town, rumors of violence and terror following their wake. But until now, it had always seemed like something far off, something that wouldn't touch her or her family. Now, it had come knocking at their doorstep. She stepped outside, feeling the cool breeze on her skin, her mind already running through the possibilities. The Black Riders would likely regroup and come back in full force, armed with more than just intimidation. They'd learned the hard way that Eliza wasn't going to bow to them, and that was something they wouldn't forget. As Eliza walked to the barn, she thought about her next steps. She'd need to strengthen her defenses, both for the ranch and for herself. It wasn't just about taking on the bikers anymore. It was about eliminating the threat they posed to everyone she loved, to the town that had been her home for as long as she could remember. She knew the fight ahead of her wasn't just a physical one. It was a battle of wits, strategy, and sheer willpower. And Eliza Hayes wasn't about to lose. Inside the barn, the faint smell of hay and leather filled the air. She moved quickly, going to the back corner where she had stashed her gear. It was a collection of military-grade weapons and tools, carefully maintained and ready to be used at a moment's notice. The gear was a reminder of her past, of the days when she had been part of something bigger, something dangerous. But now, those skills would serve a different purpose. They would help her defend her home. Eliza's fingers grazed over the edges of the weapons, each one a piece of her training. A sniper rifle, sleek and silent. A set of throwing knives, balanced and deadly. A combat knife, worn but reliable. She had learned to use them all. But now, she was faced with a different kind of enemy. One that wasn't easily dealt with by brute force alone. The Black Riders weren't a militia or an army. They were criminals, thugs who had built their empire on fear. But fear, Eliza knew, could be used against them. The key to taking them down would be striking where they least expected it. At the heart of their operation, her mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. She would need allies. People who could help her bring down the Black Riders once and for all. But who could she trust? Deadwood Ridge was a small town, and there weren't many who could go up against a gang like the Black Riders. But Eliza was resourceful. She had spent enough time in the military to know that every problem had a solution. Sometimes, you just had to dig a little deeper to find it. She stepped back outside, the weight of her decisions settling over her like a cloak. There was no turning back now. The fight was coming, and she was ready. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet for Eliza's liking. After the confrontation with Vince and the Black Riders, the town of Deadwood Ridge seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with the unspoken fear that hung over every corner, every creaky door and cracked window. People went about their business, but there was a constant unease beneath the surface, a knowing that things weren't as simple as they once were. It wasn't just the Black Riders who had changed the dynamic. It was what they represented. An invasion, an encroachment on something that had been sacred, untouched. Eliza had no time for the fear that clung to the town like a fog. She was too focused, too consumed with the fight that was coming. She had learned long ago that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when lives were on the line. And right now, the lives of everyone she cared about were at risk. It was late afternoon when she finally decided to reach out to the one person she knew she could trust, Lena, a former comrade from her military days. Lena had retired from the service a few years ago, just like Eliza, but she had returned to her roots, settling in a nearby town, working as a mechanic. But what Lena did best wasn't fixing cars. It was thinking strategically, making the impossible seem possible. If anyone could help Eliza take down the Black Riders, it was Lena. Eliza rode out to Lena's place, a small house on the edge of town, surrounded by rusted car parts and tools strewn about like a battlefield. It looked exactly like the kind of place where Lena would thrive. A chaotic mess, but one that made perfect sense to her. Eliza pulled up to the driveway and killed the engine, her boots hitting the dirt with a thud as she walked toward the front door. She didn't knock. She never did. Lena always knew when she was coming. The door creaked open before Eliza even reached it, and Lena stood there, wiping her hands on an old rag, her eyes sharp and calculating. "I heard the engines," Lena said, her voice gravelly from years of smoke and laughter. "You're looking for something. What is it this time?" Eliza didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The Black Riders. They're not done with Deadwood Ridge, and neither are we." Lena's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. She had heard the rumors, the whispers about the bikers and the trouble they were stirring up. She'd known it wouldn't be long before Eliza came to her. "What do you need?" "I need help," Eliza said, her voice firm, steady. "I'm going to take them down, Lena." but I can't do it alone. I need you to help me hit them where it hurts." Lena leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. "You're talking about a full-on assault, Eliza. These guys don't play nice. You've seen what they can do." "I know," Eliza replied, "but I've been trained for this. They think they can run this town. I'm going to make them wish they never came here." Lena studied her for a moment, her gaze calculating. "You know what you're asking, right? You want me to throw in with you. This isn't a small job. We're talking about bringing down a criminal empire." Eliza's jaw tightened. "I've been through worse." For a long moment, Lena didn't say anything. Then, with a resigned sigh, she pushed off the doorframe. "All right, I'll help, but you're not going in half-cocked. We're going to need a plan. A real one." Eliza nodded. "I've got some ideas, but I need your expertise." Lena grinned, her hands slipping into the pockets of her worn leather jacket. "Good. Let's make this interesting." Over the next few days, the two women worked together like a well-oiled machine, putting together a plan that would have made anyone else nervous. They'd mapped out the Black Riders' operations, studying every move the bikers had made in the region. They had contacts, resources, and most importantly, the element of surprise on their side. Eliza had always been good at reading people, and she knew that Vince Moretti was arrogant, proud, but too self-assured for his own good. It was a weakness she planned to exploit, but they needed more than just strategy. They needed muscle. They needed the people of Deadwood Ridge to stand with them. And that was where things got complicated. Eliza knew that the town's residents weren't warriors. They weren't prepared to take on a gang of bikers with years of criminal activity under their belts. But they had something that the Black Riders didn't: home field advantage. It was the one thing Eliza had in spades. She gathered the town's most trusted citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, anyone who had the courage to stand with her. One by one, she went to each of them, explaining what was at stake, laying out the plan, and giving them a choice. Either they stood and fought, or they got out of the way. The response was mixed. Some were ready to pick up arms and defend their homes. Others were scared, too frightened of the Black Riders to even consider fighting back. But for those who did agree to join her cause, Eliza made it clear that they were in this together. There would be no turning back. If the Black Riders wanted to take Deadwood Ridge, they would have to go through every last one of them. As the days passed, Eliza and Lena continued their preparations, sharpening their skills and fortifying the town. They set traps, dug in positions, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of Eliza's mind, something she couldn't shake. Vince Moretti would come for her again, and next time, he wouldn't just send a few bikers to intimidate her. He'd come with everything he had. The storm was coming, and when it hit, Eliza Hayes would be ready. The wind had shifted in the days, leading up to the inevitable clash. There was a sharpness to the air now, a biting chill that seemed to crawl beneath the skin of Deadwood Ridge. It was as though the town itself could sense what was coming. An all-out war, a reckoning that would change everything. Eliza stood at the edge of the town, her eyes scanning the horizon as the sun dipped low, casting the land in a golden light that seemed to mock the tension in the air. The plan had been set. The town was fortified as best as it could be, with traps hidden in plain sight, armed citizens positioned where they could do the most damage, and escape routes ready for those who couldn't fight. But as Eliza stared into the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something important, something vital to the success of the operation. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Lena walked up beside her, the quiet clink of her boots in the dirt the only sound between them. "You're thinking too much," Lena said, her voice low, yet sharp with the kind of clarity that only came with experience. Eliza turned her head slightly but didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a slow breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. She hadn't been able to shake the unease that had gnawed at her all day. The pieces were in place. The strategy was sound. Yet, there was still a sense of impending chaos, something that couldn't be planned for, something wild and uncontrollable. Lena's eyes were locked on the same horizon, but her expression was different, calm, collected. Lena was a woman who had made peace with the unpredictable nature of war, the way chaos could turn in an instant, and yet, how that same chaos could be turned to your advantage if you knew how to ride it. It was something Eliza had learned during their military days together, a lesson that had kept them both alive. "You still think they're gonna roll over?" Lena asked, her gaze shifting toward Eliza. Eliza's lips curled into a tight smile. "No, I don't think they'll roll over. But they'll have no choice but to face us head-on. They've underestimated us. They're used to terrorizing towns that are too scared to fight back. This time, they'll be the ones running." Lena let out a low whistle, a sound that could have been amusement, but there was something darker underneath it. "Well, if they think that, then I guess they don't know you." "No," Eliza agreed, her eyes hardening. "They don't." There was a brief pause, as if the land itself was holding its breath with them, waiting for what was coming next. But as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in reds and purples, Eliza knew it wouldn't be long now. The bikers would be coming soon. It was time. "Everything's set," Lena said, finally breaking the silence. "The boys are in place. The traps are primed. I even had a few of my old contacts send in some supplies for backup. We've got enough firepower to make a statement." Eliza nodded, but her mind raced through the details once more. Nothing could be left to chance. The Black Riders might not be a professional military force, but they were dangerous in their own right. Ruthless, chaotic, and unpredictable. They had the numbers, they had the intimidation, and they had the arrogance that came with thinking they were untouchable. But arrogance was a weakness, and Eliza was going to exploit it. "I'll take the west side," Eliza said, turning her attention to Lena. "You cover the east. We'll funnel them into the main street. Once they're there, it's game over." Lena grinned, a wild spark in her eyes. "I like it, but don't forget, I'm not just a mechanic. I've got a few tricks up my sleeve, too." Eliza didn't smile, but the corners of her mouth twitched slightly. There was no question about it. Lena was the kind of ally you wanted in a fight, the kind who could think on her feet and adapt to any situation. Together, they had a chance. And that was more than the Black Riders had ever realized. As night fell and the darkness began to wrap around Deadwood Ridge, the town came alive in a different way. The streets, which had once been eerily silent, were now filled with a quiet but undeniable energy. People positioning themselves, checking their weapons, and making sure everything was in place. The town was ready, even if some were still hesitant, still fearful. The rest of the citizens knew what was at stake, and they trusted Eliza. The soft glow of lanterns flickered in the distance, casting shadows that danced across the ground. Eliza moved through the streets like a shadow herself, silent, focused, her every step calculated. She had trained for this moment, fought in countless battles, faced death more times than she cared to count. But this felt different. This wasn't a foreign conflict, a mission far from home. This was personal. This was her home, and she would protect it with everything she had. It wasn't long before the rumble of motorcycles reached their ears, low, deep, unmistakable. They were coming. Vince Moretti and his gang had arrived. Eliza's hand instinctively went to the hilt of her knife, feeling the familiar weight, the cold steel that had become an extension of herself over the years. She didn't need to look back to know that Lena was ready, too. The tension in the air was thick now, the quiet before the storm, where every second felt like an eternity. And then, the silence was shattered. The first motorcycle roared down the main street, and behind it came the rest of the Black Riders, their engines growling like hungry beasts. Vince Moretti was at the front, his face twisted in that same smug arrogance that Eliza had seen before. But this time, there was something different in his eyes, a recognition that things had changed. And as the bikers flooded into the town, the trap was set. Eliza's heart pounded, her pulse quickening with the thrill of what was to come. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything she believed in. And tonight, Deadwood Ridge would either stand, or it would fall. The roar of the motorcycles grew louder as they approached, filling the streets of Deadwood Ridge with the sound of impending chaos. It was no longer a question of if the Black Riders would come. They were here, their engines growling like beasts as they barreled down the narrow streets, weaving between the buildings with the kind of swagger that only comes from years of ruling by fear. Eliza stood at the edge of the town square, her eyes locked on the approaching convoy, her breath slow and steady. She had been waiting for this moment for days, weeks even. The time for preparation was over. This was the moment she had fought for. The moment when the fate of Deadwood Ridge would be decided. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of movement, the shuffle of boots, the low murmurs of the townspeople who had come together for this fight. There was no turning back now. The people of Deadwood Ridge had made their choice, and they were ready. Even the ones who were terrified, even the ones who didn't know how to hold a gun. They had a fire in them now, a spark of something that had been long dormant. They were fighting for their homes, for their way of life. And for Eliza, that was more than enough. She glanced to her left, where Lena was already in position, crouched behind a pile of crates with a sniper rifle in hand. She didn't need to say a word. Lena knew exactly what to do. The woman had a deadly calm about her, an ability to focus in the midst of chaos. And that was what they needed right now. Precision, discipline, and absolute control. Eliza took another breath, feeling the weight of the knife at her side, the comforting presence of her military gear, the knowledge that she had prepared for every scenario she could think of. Her mind raced through the plan one final time. Funnel them down the main street, force them into an open area where they could be surrounded. Make them fight on her terms, not theirs. She nodded to Lena, and the signal was given. The first trap was sprung. From the alleyways, hidden among the buildings, several barrels of oil erupted in a shower of sparks, the sound of flames crackling through the air as the fire lit up the streets. The bikers had no idea what hit them. For a brief moment, there was confusion. Their vehicles skidded, tires spinning on the slick, burning road as they tried to regain control. It was all Eliza needed. "Now!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. And like that, the town of Deadwood Ridge sprang to life. The first wave of fire from the townspeople came from hidden positions along the rooftops, where several residents, trained by Eliza in the days leading up to this moment, aimed carefully at the bikers. The shots were precise, aimed at the tires, the engines, anything that would cripple the convoy and make it harder for them to escape. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, sharp cracks that ricocheted off the walls, deafening in the otherwise quiet night. Vince Moretti's gang wasn't ready for this. They had expected a small town to bend, to fold under pressure. They had underestimated the resolve of the people here. As the first few bikers were taken down, their motorcycles crashing into buildings or skidding across the burning ground, the rest of the gang started to panic. "Get off the road," one of the bikers shouted, trying to herd his comrades away from the traps, but it was too late. Eliza didn't wait for them to regroup. She dashed from her position, moving quickly but quietly, her boots hitting the dirt with calculated precision. She wasn't alone. Other townspeople followed her lead, taking advantage of the confusion. Their faces were grim, determined. They had no choice but to fight now, and Eliza would lead them every step of the way. As she sprinted toward the center of the street, her mind was clear, focused. She could hear the yelling and chaos around her, the sound of bikes revving, the desperate attempts of the black riders to regain control. But none of it fazed her. She had trained for moments like this. The noise, the unpredictability, the chaos, it was all part of the plan. She turned a corner, coming face to face with a group of bikers who had attempted to flank her position. They hadn't seen her coming. Their eyes widened for a split second before Eliza lunged forward, her knife flashing through the air in a blur. She moved with deadly grace, her training taking over as she sliced through the air, taking down the closest biker in a single movement. Another tried to retaliate, but Eliza's foot caught his leg, throwing him off balance. In a heartbeat, she had him on the ground, her knee pressing into his chest as she pinned him with the blade at his throat. "Tell your friends to leave," Eliza said through gritted teeth, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Or this is just the beginning." The biker's eyes widened in terror as he realized just how outmatched he was. He looked at his comrades, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're crazy," he spat, but his voice trembled. "You can't win this." Eliza pressed the knife harder, her gaze unwavering. "Try me." Behind her, the sounds of more fighting erupted. The Black Riders were getting organized again, but their formation was sloppy now, disarrayed. The townspeople, emboldened by the chaos, were holding their ground. And somewhere off in the distance, Eliza knew that Lena was doing exactly what they had planned. Taking out the bikers from a distance, picking them off one by one. The balance was shifting. The Black Riders had come in expecting a fight. What they hadn't expected was a battle they couldn't win. "Tell them to go," Eliza demanded, her voice growing colder. The biker sputtered, sweat pouring down his face. "They won't stop. They'll come for you all. They'll—" He didn't finish the sentence. A shot rang out from above, a sharp crack followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting the ground. Eliza glanced up to see Lena perched on a rooftop, her rifle lowering slowly, the smoke from the gun still swirling in the air. Lena gave her a brief nod, confirming the kill, then disappeared into the shadows once more. Eliza turned back to the biker beneath her, who was now trembling. "I think your friends are learning the hard way that Deadwood Ridge isn't as easy to take as they thought." He stared at her, but there was no fire left in his eyes, only fear. And that was exactly what she needed. The night had turned into a frenzy, a blur of gunfire, shouting, and the screeching of motorcycles struggling to maneuver in the chaos. Vince Moretti and his gang had never expected this level of resistance. They were used to being the terror, the ones who commanded fear. But now, fear was creeping into their ranks, and it was spreading fast. Eliza's heart pounded, but there was no hesitation in her actions. Each step, each breath, each movement was deliberate, calculated. This was her element, control amidst the chaos. The fight had erupted all around her, but she could see everything clearly. Her mind was sharp, focused, sifting through the battlefield like a master strategist. She released the biker beneath her with a swift shove, sending him scrambling away. As he fled into the chaos, she glanced back toward the center of the street. A few of the Black Riders were regrouping, trying to gather their bearings, but they were disorganized. The fear in their eyes was undeniable now, their arrogance replaced with doubt. And that doubt was their downfall. "Stay on them," Eliza shouted to the townspeople who had joined the fight. Her voice rang out with authority, even as she continued moving, her gaze scanning for the next threat. "We're not letting them turn this around." She could hear the distant crack of Lena's rifle from another rooftop, the shots precise and deadly. With each pull of the trigger, another biker fell, their attempts to regroup growing more futile. Lena was picking them off, one by one, with the ruthless efficiency that had made her such a valuable ally in the military. From her vantage point, she could see the big picture, and Eliza was sure Lena's eyes were scanning for any sign of weakness in the bikers' formation. But it wasn't just about the bikers' physical weakness, it was about their mentality. They were fighters, sure, but they were also bullies. They thrived on fear, and when that fear was turned against them, they crumbled. The Black Riders had never been forced to fight for their survival like this before. Eliza's knife gleamed in the dim light as she moved through the street, a blur of motion as she dispatched another biker who had attempted to corner one of the townspeople. The man went down in seconds, his own surprise at how quickly it all happened reflected in his wide eyes. Eliza didn't even break stride. The sound of motorcycles revving fiercely in the distance signaled the arrival of reinforcements, but Eliza had anticipated that. She had set traps at the edge of town, explosives, barriers, and even a few abandoned vehicles that had been rigged to block the road. As the bikers approached, the first few collided with the traps, the explosions sending shockwaves through the night. The resulting chaos further fractured the Black Riders' resolve, their efforts to advance halted by the confusion and smoke. Eliza saw one of the bikers coming toward her from the side, his eyes burning with rage. He had seen what she did to his comrades, and now he was looking for payback. He revved the engine of his motorcycle and aimed it straight at her, his intentions clear. He wasn't planning on stopping until he hit her. It was a move that would have intimidated anyone else, but not Eliza. With a fluid motion, Eliza rolled out of the way, her body twisting just enough to avoid the charging bike. In a seamless move, she grabbed the biker by the arm and yanked him off the motorcycle, using his momentum to throw him to the ground. The engine roared, the bike skidding to a halt just a few feet away. The biker hit the dirt hard, but Eliza was already on him, her knee in his back, pinning him with an ease that came from years of training. Her hand held the knife to his throat, and for a moment, their eyes locked. He looked up at her, a grimace on his face as he tried to breathe. His chest heaved, but there was no fight left in him. He was a thug, a man who thrived on fear. But in this moment, it was clear that he was the one afraid. "Tell them to leave, or I will make sure you never get up again," Eliza said, her voice calm, steady, but with an unmistakable edge of finality. The biker swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he held them up, signaling surrender. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said everything. He had been broken. The Black Riders were losing, and they knew it. Just then, a loud, furious shout cut through the smoke-filled air. It was Vince. "Stop! Fall back!" Vince Moretti's voice rang out, laced with the kind of frustration and fear that only a leader who had lost control could express. Eliza's eyes narrowed. Vince was finally getting the message. The Black Riders weren't invincible. They weren't the unstoppable force they thought they were. They had underestimated the town of Deadwood Ridge, and now they were paying the price. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. As Vince barked orders, his men began to pull back, regrouping in what was left of their formation. But it wasn't the organized retreat they had planned. It was chaos. Riders scrambled to get their bikes in gear, trying to escape the traps, the fire, the chaos that had turned their invasion into a disaster. Eliza knew this was their moment. "Push forward," she shouted to the townspeople, her voice rising above the noise. "This is it. We finish it now." And with that, the tide of the battle turned for good. The remaining bikers, disorganized and demoralized, were easy prey for the people of Deadwood Ridge. They had come for blood, for control, but now, it was their blood that spilled onto the streets. Eliza and her makeshift army of townsfolk charged forward, taking advantage of the confusion. Each biker who remained in the fight was quickly overwhelmed, pinned down by the sheer numbers of people who had finally found their courage. And then, amidst the chaos, Eliza saw him. Vince Moretti, on his motorcycle, trying desperately to push through the disarray. His face twisted in rage. His hands gripped the handlebars so tightly his knuckles were white. He was trying to escape. He was trying to salvage whatever pride he had left. But Eliza wasn't about to let him. With a surge of determination, Eliza sprinted toward him, her boots pounding against the pavement. She could see the panic in his eyes as he tried to rev the engine, but the damage was already done. His bike sputtered, and he was boxed in by the wreckage of his men's vehicles, the flames licking at the edges of the street. Vince's eyes met hers just as she reached him. This time, there was no arrogance, no cocky bravado. There was only fear. "You're done, Vince," Eliza said coldly, her voice slicing through the air like a knife. "This town is ours now, and you're leaving." Vince opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get a word out, Eliza's fist collided with his jaw with a force that sent him reeling backward. His bike tipped over, crashing to the ground beside him. And just like that, the leader of the Black Riders was down. The battlefield was littered with the remnants of the Black Riders' failed invasion. Flames licking at the wreckage of their motorcycles, bodies sprawled across the streets, and the quiet, tense aftermath of a war that had been fought on their terms, but won by Deadwood Ridge. The sounds of battle had faded, but the air still crackled with the weight of what had just happened. For the first time in years, the town had reclaimed its sense of control, its sense of ownership. The people had stood together, fought together, and won. Eliza stood over Vince Moretti, her breathing steady as she watched him struggle to regain his footing. He had been a giant in his own mind, a leader of a gang that terrorized the region, a man who thought his word was law. But now, on the ground, covered in dirt and blood, Vince was nothing more than a defeated thug. And Eliza was the one who had brought him down. He glared up at her, his eyes filled with venom, but there was no arrogance left, just raw, seething hatred. Vince had always been a man who thrived on fear, and now that fear was his own. "You think this is over?" he spat, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You can't stop us. We'll rebuild. We always do." Eliza's gaze never wavered. She crouched down beside him, the weight of her presence pressing down on him like a heavy stone. "No, Vince," she said quietly, her voice cold and calm. You won't rebuild. Not this time, he scoffed, his chest heaving with rage. But there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his fear. You're just one woman. What makes you think you can? Eliza's knife flashed in the dim light, just a hair's breadth away from his throat. It was a warning, a reminder of the power she held in this moment. I've taken down men far worse than you, she said, her voice like ice. And I didn't do it alone. You and your gang have terrorized these people for long enough. It ends tonight. Deadwood Ridge doesn't belong to you. It never did. The anger in Vince's eyes burned, but it was fleeting. He could feel it now, the finality of his defeat. The Black Riders were broken, scattered, and Eliza had orchestrated their downfall with methodical precision. His empire was in ruins, and there was nothing he could do to save it. You're nothing, he muttered, his voice hollow, the words not carrying the same conviction they once did. Eliza didn't answer. She simply stood up and motioned to the townspeople who had gathered around, watching the scene unfold. They had all seen it, seen how Eliza had led them through the battle, how she had turned the tide and made them believe they could stand up to the very people who had once ruled their lives with fear. Her leadership had given them strength, and now she was offering them something else, closure. Take him into town, she said, her tone flat, devoid of emotion. Let him be a reminder of what happens when you threaten our home. A few of the townsfolk, who had been part of the battle, moved in to restrain Vince, pulling him to his feet and marching him toward the heart of Deadwood Ridge. There was no longer any need for further violence. The message had been sent. The Black Riders had been routed, and their leader was nothing more than a prisoner of war. Eliza turned her back on him, her thoughts already moving to the next challenge. The battle had been won, but there was still much work to be done. The town was in ruins, their homes and businesses damaged in the fight. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, Deadwood Ridge was safe, and that was what mattered. Lena appeared beside her, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the area. It's over, Eliza, she said, her voice laced with relief. We did it. Eliza nodded, though her expression remained stoic. The adrenaline had begun to wear off, leaving her with a quiet exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. Yeah, but there's still a lot to clean up. We'll rebuild, Lena said with a grin, her tone light but knowing. One step at a time. Eliza allowed herself a brief smile at that. We will. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the aftermath of the battle settling in around them. The fires in the distance were slowly dying down, and the sounds of the remaining bikers retreating into the night had finally ceased. Deadwood Ridge was, for the first time in what felt like forever, at peace. But Eliza knew that peace wouldn't last forever. There would be other threats, other challenges. There always were. But for tonight, they had one. Tonight, the town had found its strength, and Eliza had found hers. The battle wasn't just hers. It had been the town's, and they had fought for it together. And in that moment, as the stars above shone through the smoke-filled sky, Eliza knew that Deadwood Ridge had a future. Not because of her, but because of the people who had stood beside her. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but they would face them as one. For the first time in years, Eliza felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by the hope of something new, a future, not defined by violence or fear, but by the resilience of the people who called this town home. And that, she knew, was the real victory. The morning after the battle, the town of Deadwood Ridge was quiet, but not in the way it had been before. The air, though thick with the smell of smoke and ash, felt somehow lighter. The oppressive weight of fear had been lifted. The people who had once hidden in their homes, afraid to step out of the shadows, now moved with a sense of purpose and pride. They had faced the Black Riders and survived. In fact, they had conquered them. Eliza walked through the streets, the remnants of the previous night's chaos all around her. Burnt-out motorcycles, abandoned weapons, shattered glass from storefront windows. But beneath it all, there was a feeling of strength rising from the heart of the town. It wasn't just the physical destruction that had been left in the wake of the battle. It was the emotional scars, the remnants of a long period of fear that had kept people silent and submissive. But those scars, much like the town itself, would heal. And Eliza, though exhausted, was determined to help them heal. She paused in front of the old town hall, a sturdy building that had served as the center of Deadwood Ridge for decades. Now, it was a hub for organizing the town's recovery. Bill Hayes, her father, stood in front of it, talking with a few of the more established citizens. He caught sight of Eliza and gave her a nod. "You look like hell," Bill said with a wry smile, but there was pride in his voice. "But I suppose you've earned it." Eliza offered a weary smile in return, but she didn't have the energy to respond with her usual sharp wit. The battle had drained her, emotionally and physically. She had fought hard, but now there was something more difficult ahead: the rebuilding. The true work of recovery wasn't in the battle itself, it was in the aftermath. "It's not over yet," Eliza said, looking around at the damage. "There's still a lot to do." Bill nodded. "We'll get it done. We always do." For a moment, father and daughter simply stood there, taking in the scene. Eliza could feel the weight of his gaze on her, not just because she was his daughter, but because of what she had accomplished. He had never been one for praise, always more concerned with the land and the work that needed to be done. But in that moment, Eliza knew he was proud of her in a way that was rare for him to express. And it was the first time in a long while that she felt like she truly belonged here. In this town she had always called home. The sound of footsteps behind her broke the silence. She turned to see Lena approaching, her face tired but still holding that steady, unshakable calm. "You know, I didn't think I'd see the day when Deadwood Ridge actually pulled off a victory like that," Lena said, her voice tinged with amusement. Eliza chuckled, though the sound was hollow. "Neither did I. We did it, though," Lena continued. "And now we've got a chance to build something better. The Black Riders won't come back after this." "I don't know about that," Eliza said, her expression serious. "Vince might be done, but there are others out there. The Black Riders were just the beginning." Lena tilted her head slightly, considering Eliza's words. "You think there's more coming?" Eliza paused for a moment, her mind turning over the events of the past few days. "There always is. But that's why we'll be ready." Her gaze drifted back to the town. It was true, the Black Riders had been a serious threat, but they weren't the only danger lurking in the shadows. There were always others: criminals, opportunists, anyone who saw a town like Deadwood Ridge, raw and vulnerable, and thought they could take it. Eliza had seen enough to know that danger didn't just go away. It had to be fought off, again and again. But now, she had the support of the people here, and together, they could handle whatever came next. As the town slowly came to life around them, Eliza felt the first true spark of hope she had felt in a long time. The people had come together and fought for their home. They had proven that Deadwood Ridge wasn't just a place on a map, it was a community. And that was something more powerful than any gang of bikers. The next few days were filled with hard work. The town's businesses began reopening, the roads cleared of debris, and the injured were tended to. Eliza's father worked side by side with the other ranchers and farmers to rebuild what had been destroyed in the battle. People who had once been afraid to lift a weapon now stood together, side by side, clearing the wreckage of the Black Riders' assault. But amid all the rebuilding, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. She couldn't forget Vince's words, the way he had told her that this wouldn't be the end. And while he may have been defeated, she knew that there would always be others: greedy men, corrupt forces, anyone looking to take advantage of a small town's vulnerability. She couldn't allow Deadwood Ridge to become a target again. One evening, as she walked through the town's main street, Lena caught up to her. "You're still thinking about what comes next, aren't you?" Eliza stopped walking and looked at her friend, her expression hard. "We can't afford to stop thinking about it. The Black Riders were only one piece of the puzzle. I'm not naive enough to think we're out of the woods." Lena nodded, understanding exactly what Eliza meant. "So what's the plan?" "The plan," Eliza said, her voice steady, "is to build something that can't be taken down. Not by bikers, not by criminals, not by anyone. We make Deadwood Ridge a place that fights back. We make sure the next time someone comes knocking, they know exactly who they're dealing with." Lena raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to do that?" Eliza turned to face her, her eyes burning with conviction. "We build an army, not just of weapons, but of people. We train them. We make sure they know how to protect this town, how to fight back." We turned Deadwood Ridge into a place no one can threaten. Lena smiled, the kind of smile that said she was ready for whatever came next. Well, you've got me. I'm in. Eliza allowed herself a small, weary smile in return. Good. I'll need you. But this isn't just about us. It's about everyone in this town. Together, we can make sure Deadwood Ridge never has to face another fight like the one we just won. As the two women stood there, looking out at the town they had saved, Eliza felt the spark of something stronger than hope. It was resolve. Deadwood Ridge wasn't just going to survive. It was going to thrive. And whatever came next, they would face it together. Weeks had passed since the Black Riders' defeat, but the scars of that night were still visible. The town of Deadwood Ridge had begun to rebuild, but the wounds ran deep. Both the physical damage to homes and businesses and the emotional toll it had taken on the people. Fear, though diminished, still clung to the edges of their daily lives, a reminder of how easily it could all be taken away. Eliza stood on the edge of her father's ranch, her gaze sweeping across the land that stretched for miles. The rolling hills, the open sky. It was a landscape she had known since she was a child. And yet, standing here now, it felt different. There was a weight to the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. The town had won the battle, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Her mind drifted back to the promise she had made to herself after the Black Riders had been driven out. Deadwood Ridge would never again be the kind of place that could be so easily taken advantage of. It had been easy to think that after a victory, the fight would end. But Eliza knew better. She had seen it before. How quickly things could spiral out of control when no one was watching, when people became complacent. Her father's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're out here again, Eliza. You're gonna wear yourself out if you don't slow down." She turned to see Bill Hayes walking toward her, his weathered face framed by the morning sun. He had always been the steady one, the rock that held the family together. He hadn't been the same after the battle. He had lost some of the old spark that used to burn in his eyes. But Eliza understood. A man like him wasn't made for war. He was made for work, for the land. "I can't help it, Dad," Eliza said, her voice tight. "There's still too much to do. I keep thinking, what if the Black Riders weren't the only ones? What if there's more out there waiting for the right moment?" Bill stopped a few feet away from her, his boots crunching in the dirt as he looked out over the land. "I know what you mean, but this town has survived worse than the Black Riders. We'll survive whatever comes next, too. You've already done more for this place than anyone could have expected." Eliza shook her head. "It's not enough. I've seen how people like Vince Moretti work. If they want something, they'll come back for it. And I won't let that happen again." Her father's gaze softened, and for a moment, he was the father she remembered. Steadfast, calm. "Then it's time you stop looking over your shoulder, Eliza. You've earned the right to rest. But it's your choice. You want to spend your life guarding a town that's already won? Or do you want to help us rebuild it?" She didn't answer right away, her mind still swirling with the thoughts of what could come next. But she knew her father was right. They had won, and they had earned the right to rest. The people of Deadwood Ridge had stood tall, and they had proven that when the time came, they could defend themselves. But rebuilding wasn't just about the walls of the town or the homes. It was about the people who lived there. And Eliza knew her work wasn't over. It had only just begun. As she turned to walk back toward the ranch house, her father falling into step beside her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the true test was still ahead. Deadwood Ridge had been broken before, but it had survived. The people here had endured. And now, it was time to make sure that they would never have to face that kind of fear again. Back in town, Lena was already hard at work, helping organize the next phase of recovery. She had become an indispensable part of the rebuilding effort, not just because of her skills, but because of the unwavering confidence she instilled in the people around her. It was a good thing, too. Eliza needed allies like her, people who could see the bigger picture and help turn it into reality. "You're late," Lena said as Eliza arrived at the town hall, where they had set up a makeshift command center to plan the reconstruction efforts. The place was bustling with activity, maps spread out on the table, citizens of all kinds working together to repair homes, businesses, and infrastructure. It was a mess, but it was also a sign of hope. People were coming together. They weren't just rebuilding. They were reimagining what Deadwood Ridge could be. I know, Eliza replied, her eyes scanning the room. I needed some air. It's hard to keep focus when you're staring at the same four walls all day. Lena gave a knowing smile. I get it. I'm the same way. But we're almost there. Just a little more time, and we'll have this place looking better than ever. I hope so, Eliza said. But there's still one thing that bothers me. Lena raised an eyebrow. What's that? I don't think the Black Riders were just a random gang. They were organized, and they had resources. I've been digging around, trying to get a better picture of what they were really after. It wasn't just the town, Lena. They were looking for something. Maybe more than one thing. Lena's expression shifted, the lightheartedness fading from her features. You think there's something bigger at play? Eliza nodded. I'm not sure yet, but we need to keep our eyes open. The Black Riders were just one symptom of a much larger problem. We've seen the kind of men who thrive in the shadows, men who think they can take whatever they want. And there's a whole network out there, one that doesn't just disappear because one gang is taken out. Lena exhaled slowly, looking toward the map on the table. You're right, but we can't fight every battle at once. Let's get this place back on its feet first. Then we start looking beyond the horizon. Eliza agreed, though her gut told her that they wouldn't have the luxury of waiting. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she knew this much. Deadwood Ridge had survived the Black Riders, but whatever was coming next, she would make sure it was met head-on. And this time, the people wouldn't just be defending their town. They would be fighting for their future. The days stretched into weeks, and the town of Deadwood Ridge slowly began to heal. The streets that had once echoed with the roars of motorcycles and the fear of bikers now hummed with the sound of hammers, the clink of tools, and the laughter of children playing outside. The town that had been brought to its knees was rising again, stronger than ever. Eliza stood at the edge of the town square, watching as people worked together, rebuilding what had been torn down. It was a sight she had dreamed of, a town united in purpose, determined to reclaim its future. But the nagging feeling that had gnawed at her since the Black Riders' defeat had only grown stronger. There was something more to this victory, something she still couldn't put her finger on. It wasn't just the bikers who had come for Deadwood Ridge. It was the system that had allowed them to succeed, the shadows that had sheltered them. And if Deadwood Ridge was to truly be free, Eliza knew they had to face what was lurking in those shadows. Lena was busy with the logistical side of things, organizing the rebuilding efforts, ensuring supplies were being distributed evenly, and coordinating with the neighboring towns to bring in reinforcements if needed. She had become the pillar of stability in Deadwood Ridge, a constant force of determination. But Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that the worst wasn't over yet. She had seen too much, been through too much, to think that a single victory could solve everything. A voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. Eliza, Bill Hayes called from behind her. He stood at the corner of the ranch house, his hands resting on his hips. His weathered face was as stoic as ever, but there was something different in his posture now, a sense of pride that hadn't been there before. Eliza turned to face her father, her mind still swirling with the questions that had been plaguing her. What is it, Dad? Bill motioned for her to come closer. There's something you need to see. Someone's here to talk to you. Eliza's eyebrows furrowed, but she followed her father toward the front of the house. As they approached, she saw a figure standing near the front gate. A man, dressed in a long coat, with a hat pulled low over his face. He was tall, his posture rigid, but there was an air about him that made Eliza pause. The man lifted his head as she approached, his cold, calculating eyes locking onto hers. Eliza Hayes, the man said in a deep voice that held no warmth. We need to talk. Bill stepped aside, and Eliza found herself standing in front of the stranger, his presence commanding but not threatening. Yet, she instinctively placed a hand on the knife at her belt, her eyes never leaving his. Who are you? She asked, her voice steady, her posture defensive. The man didn't answer at first. He simply studied her, his gaze cold and unwavering. My name's John Carter, he finally said. I'm with the government. I've been watching you. Watching Deadwood Ridge. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what to make of this. The government? She hadn't seen any federal agents in town before, not after the Black Riders anyway. "What do you want?" Eliza asked, her voice sharp. Carter took a slow breath, his eyes flicking to Bill for a moment before returning to Eliza. "I've been tracking the movements of criminal organizations across the region, and I've got reason to believe that Deadwood Ridge wasn't just a target for the Black Riders. There's something bigger going on, and I think you're part of it." Eliza's instincts kicked in. She didn't trust this man. Not yet. Something about him felt off. "I don't know what you're talking about." Carter stepped forward, his tone firm but not threatening. "The Black Riders were only a small piece of the puzzle, Eliza. They were the muscle. But there's someone else pulling the strings. Someone much bigger. And they're not going to stop just because you ran a bunch of bikers out of town." Eliza's mind raced. She had suspected as much. Vince Moretti had always been too arrogant to be the mastermind behind the Black Riders' operations. But who was this shadowy figure Carter was talking about? "What do you know?" Eliza asked, her voice low but intense. Carter hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a small folder from inside his coat. He handed it to her, and Eliza opened it, scanning the contents. It was filled with photos, documents, and notes. Names she didn't recognize, locations she didn't know, but all of it tied to one thing: a sprawling criminal network that extended far beyond Deadwood Ridge. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," Carter said, his voice low. "You've already made enemies, and now they know who you are. You're not just some rancher's daughter anymore. You're a threat." Eliza glanced at the papers again, her mind trying to process the information. This wasn't just about defending her town anymore. It was about a battle that was much larger, much deeper than she had ever imagined. She closed the folder and handed it back to Carter. "What do you want from me?" "I want your help," Carter said simply. "I want you to join us. We've been tracking this network for years, but it's too big for us to handle alone. You've got the skills. You've got the drive. I think you're exactly what we need to take this down." Eliza's jaw tightened. She had always been willing to do whatever it took to protect her town, but joining forces with the government? It was dangerous. It meant stepping into a world she had been trying to leave behind, a world where loyalty and trust could be bought and sold. But as she looked at Carter, at the files he had handed her, she knew that she didn't have a choice. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Fine," Eliza said after a long pause. "I'll help, but understand this. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for Deadwood Ridge, and I won't be your pawn." Carter nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Eliza turned and walked toward the ranch house, her mind already calculating the risks, the consequences, and the steps she needed to take next. This wasn't just a fight for her town anymore. It was a fight for something much bigger, and no matter what happened, she wouldn't back down. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The sudden appearance of John Carter and his proposition to Eliza weighed heavily on her mind. She had agreed to help, but the decision wasn't one she made lightly. Joining forces with the government was a complicated and dangerous path, one that would take her deep into a world she had long avoided. But what choice did she have? The enemy was larger than she had imagined, and Deadwood Ridge was still vulnerable. The information Carter had given her was just the beginning, a mere glimpse into the dark world that lurked beyond the edges of town. The criminal network was vast, stretching across states, its tendrils winding into the political, business, and law enforcement sectors. Vince Moretti and the Black Riders were just one cog in the machine. But who was the mastermind behind it all? Eliza couldn't stop thinking about it. The faces in the photos Carter had handed her, the names she didn't recognize. Were they all connected? And if so, how? She had never been one to sit idle, and this was a puzzle that demanded to be solved. She met Lena late that night, the two of them sitting around the kitchen table in the ranch house, poring over the documents Carter had left behind. The town was quiet outside, the only sound the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But inside, the weight of the situation hung thick between them. Lena flicked through the papers, her expression darkening with each page. "This is bigger than I thought," she said, her voice low. "You were right. The Black Riders weren't the real threat. They were just the muscle." Eliza nodded, rubbing her temples. "And there's more." Carter thinks we're getting closer to the heart of it, but I don't trust him. There's something about him that doesn't sit right with me. Lena raised an eyebrow. You're not the type to trust easily anyway. So, what's your plan? You're not just going to take this guy's word for it, are you? Eliza leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. No, I'm not. But he's right about one thing. We can't do this alone. I need to figure out who's really pulling the strings here. And I need to find out who else is involved. Lena studied her for a moment before speaking. If you're going to go after someone this powerful, you need to be careful, Eliza. This isn't just some gang you can chase down. These are people with resources, connections. They'll come for you if they feel threatened. Eliza's eyes narrowed. I know that, but we've already taken the first step. We've made them see that Deadwood Ridge isn't an easy target. I won't let them tear this place apart. The weight of her words hung in the air. Eliza knew the stakes were high, but she also knew this was no longer just about her. It was about the future of her town, her people. She couldn't back down. Not now. So, what's next? Lena asked, breaking the silence. Eliza leaned forward, her mind already racing. We need to dig deeper. Carter gave us a lead, but we need to know who else is connected to this network. I'm going to reach out to some of my old contacts, people who might know more. We need information, and we need it fast. Lena nodded. All right, let's do this. But you're not going into this alone. I'll be right there with you, every step of the way. Eliza gave her a small smile. I know. I'm not doing this without you. The next few days were a whirlwind. Eliza used every resource she had, calling in favors, meeting with old contacts, and following every lead she could find. Some panned out, others led nowhere. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the picture that emerged was clearer and far more dangerous than she had anticipated. She met with a man named Hank, a former military contact who had ties to some shady dealings in the region. He was nervous, sweating profusely as he handed over a set of coordinates and some names. This is all I know, Eliza, but I swear, it's real. You're dealing with people who play a whole different game. Be careful. The coordinates pointed to an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a neighboring town. The name on the list, Evan Ford, meant nothing to Eliza, but Hank had made it clear that this was the man at the center of the operation. The lead was cold, but it was all they had. Ford's the key, Hank had said. He's got ties to the underground, drug runners, arms deals, you name it. But he's got protection, big names in high places. You'll have to go in quiet if you want to get close. Eliza didn't hesitate. She was already planning her next move. With Lena at her side, they would track down this Ford, get the information they needed, and hopefully uncover the truth. But they both knew the risks. Getting close to someone like Ford meant stepping into a world of corruption, of power that stretched beyond what they could even begin to comprehend. The night before their planned trip, Eliza sat on the porch of the ranch house, staring out into the dark. She could feel the weight of the task ahead of her. It wasn't just about saving Deadwood Ridge anymore. It was about taking down an entire criminal network, one that had its claws in everything: politics, law enforcement, business, and beyond. Lena joined her, sitting down beside her in the darkness. You sure about this? She asked softly. Eliza didn't look at her. Instead, she stared at the stars above, the vastness of the sky offering her a sense of perspective. I don't have a choice, Lena. If we don't take this down, it'll be back. And next time, it won't be just the bikers. It'll be everything we've fought for. Lena was silent for a moment. Then, she spoke quietly. We've fought worse than this before, and we'll fight it again. Together. Eliza finally turned to look at her, her eyes filled with determination. I know, and that's why we'll win. The road ahead was uncertain, the risks higher than ever, but Eliza was more certain of one thing than she had ever been before. Deadwood Ridge was her home, and she would protect it, no matter what. The air was thick with dust as Eliza and Lena drove through the narrow, winding roads toward the coordinates Hank had provided. The further they went, the quieter the world around them seemed to grow. The town, the ranch, the comfort of home. It all felt so far away now. They were heading into unknown territory, toward an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a town that felt more like a ghost town than anything else. Eliza's gut told her that something was waiting for them, something they weren't prepared for. But there was no turning back now. The warehouse came into view just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the crumbling buildings. It was an imposing structure, large, weathered, and entirely out of place in the otherwise quiet landscape. The area was eerily quiet, save for the sound of wind rustling through the broken windows of the warehouse. Eliza parked the truck a distance away, out of sight of the building, and they both got out, moving swiftly but silently. The warehouse had been abandoned for years, or so it seemed, but that didn't mean it was empty. From Hank's description, Eliza knew that this place wasn't just a storage facility. It was a hub for something much darker, and someone named Evan Ford was at the center of it all. "Eliza, you sure about this?" Lena asked, her voice low but steady as they crouched behind a stack of old crates, peering toward the entrance of the warehouse. Eliza's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the surroundings. "There's no other way. We get in, find out what we can, and get out. Fast." Lena nodded, checking the sidearm holstered at her hip. "I've got your back." Eliza gave a brief nod in return, feeling the familiar weight of her knife and the handgun she carried beneath her jacket. She wasn't taking any chances tonight. This was the kind of operation where hesitation could get you killed. They moved silently toward the side entrance of the warehouse, avoiding the main gates where security was likely stationed. Eliza had learned a thing or two about stealth during her time in the military, and she trusted that their combined experience would give them the edge they needed. The door creaked softly as Eliza eased it open, just wide enough for them to slip through. The inside of the warehouse was dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. The air smelled musty, stale with the scent of rotting wood and rusting metal. They crept forward, their footsteps muffled by the dirt and dust that covered the floor. "Stay low," Eliza whispered. "We don't know who's here, and we don't want to alert anyone." Lena gave a soft grunt of agreement, moving carefully behind her. They kept their heads down, staying close to the shadows as they navigated through the maze of crates and rusting machinery. It was clear that this place hadn't been in use for years, but something about it didn't feel abandoned. There was a quiet hum of energy in the air, the kind of energy that comes from a place where something big is happening, something clandestine. Eliza's eyes darted from side to side, scanning for any signs of movement. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end, the sense that they were being watched, even though there was no one in sight. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, they reached a small office tucked in the back corner. The door was ajar, and the faint sound of voices filtered through. Eliza motioned for Lena to stay back as she crept forward, inching toward the door to listen. Two men's voices. One of them was calm, composed, while the other sounded agitated, like he was on the verge of losing control. "Ford won't like this," the agitated voice said, low and gruff. "He's not going to be happy if he finds out we're getting too close to this town. We need to move quickly, before she catches wind of what we're really doing." Eliza's pulse quickened. She must have been her. Someone who had been following their movements, someone important. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The other voice, smoother and colder, responded with quiet authority. "We'll deal with her when the time comes. Right now, we've got bigger problems. The Black Riders were just the beginning. We've got a network to manage. And if Hayes is really involved, then we need to step up our plans. This town was never supposed to be on our radar, but now that it is, well, we make our move." Eliza's stomach twisted as the weight of the conversation hit her. Hayes, her father, Bill Hayes. They knew about him. And whatever was happening here, whatever they were planning, it wasn't just about the Black Riders. It was about something far bigger. They had taken her family's land into consideration. This was more than just business. It was personal. Eliza signaled to Lena, her heart pounding in her chest. They had what they needed. It was time to get out before they were spotted. They backed away from the door slowly, careful not to make a sound, and retreated down a narrow corridor that led to the far side of the building. They hadn't come for a confrontation. They had come for information, and they had just learned more than they had expected. The pieces of the puzzle were falling together faster now, and the bigger picture was becoming clearer. As they neared the exit, they heard footsteps approaching. Eliza's heart raced as she gestured for Lena to move into the shadows. The door was just ahead, but it wasn't going to be easy to make it out without being noticed. The footsteps grew louder. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Eliza and Lena froze. A figure stepped into the doorway, a man, tall and muscular, his face shadowed under the brim of a hat. His eyes scanned the room, and for a split second, Eliza thought they might be caught. But the man didn't seem to notice them. Instead, he turned and walked deeper into the warehouse, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. They had been seconds away from being discovered. "Let's move," she whispered to Lena, her voice tight. "We don't have much time." They slipped through the exit just as the figure turned a corner. Eliza's pulse raced, but they were out now. The night air hit her like a wave as they made their way back to the truck, their bodies tense, ready for any sudden movement. Once they were safely in the truck, Lena turned to Eliza, her face set. "That was close. What now?" Eliza exhaled slowly, her mind already spinning with the new information. "Now, we dig deeper. We find out who this Ford is and what he's planning. And we bring this down before it reaches Deadwood Ridge." Lena gave a curt nod. "We'll get it done, whatever it takes." Eliza gripped the steering wheel, the weight of the road ahead heavy on her shoulders. She didn't know how much further this would go, or what it would take to bring the whole operation down. But one thing was certain: Deadwood Ridge was her home, and she would protect it from the darkness that was closing in. The night was still and quiet as Eliza drove the truck back toward Deadwood Ridge, the headlights cutting through the darkness in front of her. The weight of what they had discovered at the warehouse hung heavy in the air. They had stumbled onto something far bigger than they could have imagined. An operation so deep, so pervasive, that even the government had been struggling to track it. And now, it was clear that the criminal network they were dealing with had set its sights on Deadwood Ridge. Eliza's mind was spinning, going over the pieces of the puzzle. Evan Ford, this shadowy figure they had heard mentioned at the warehouse, was at the center of it all. But who was he? What was his endgame? And why had he chosen to target her town? The more questions she had, the fewer answers she seemed to find. Lena sat in the passenger seat beside her, her face hard, her eyes scanning the road ahead. The silence between them was thick, charged with the adrenaline of their close call. Lena had always been calm under pressure, but even she knew that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they had originally thought. "We need to figure out who Ford is," Lena said, breaking the silence. "If he's connected to all of this, then he's our key. We can't afford to sit back and wait for him to make the first move." "I know," Eliza replied, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "But we don't have much to go on. The only lead we've got is that warehouse. And the more we dig into it, the more I realize this whole operation is much bigger than we thought." Lena turned to her, her eyes sharp. "It's not just about the Black Riders anymore, is it? It's about power, about taking control of everything." Eliza nodded, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Exactly. And Deadwood Ridge is just a piece of the puzzle. But we're not going to let it fall into their hands. Not after everything we've fought for." They drove in silence for a while longer, the truck bouncing over the rough roads as they made their way back to town. Eliza's mind raced with possibilities, trying to connect the dots. Ford, the mysterious figure mentioned in the warehouse, was clearly connected to something bigger. The way he was described, and the tone of the conversation, suggested that he was a man with power, someone who wasn't afraid to pull strings from behind the scenes. Eliza knew they had to get closer to him, but she wasn't about to rush in without a plan. If they made a mistake, it could cost them everything. As they neared the outskirts of Deadwood Ridge, Eliza slowed the truck, her eyes scanning the horizon. Something didn't feel right. The town, once a safe haven for her, now seemed too quiet, too still. Her instincts were on high alert, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. "Lena, something's off," she murmured, her voice low. Lena's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It's just a feeling," Eliza replied, her foot easing off the gas pedal. She drove slowly into town, her eyes darting to the shadows as they passed. As they approached the center of town, Eliza saw movement ahead. A figure standing at the corner of the street, half hidden in the shadows. It wasn't unusual to see people out at this hour, But the way the figure stood, motionless, watching, made her feel uneasy. Eliza slowed the truck to a stop, her eyes never leaving the figure. Lena turned to her, her hand resting on the door handle, ready for whatever might come. "Stay here," Eliza said quietly. She wasn't sure why, but something told her that this wasn't just a random person. She wasn't going to take any chances. Eliza got out of the truck, keeping her hand close to the sidearm at her belt. She moved toward the figure, her steps cautious, her senses on high alert. "Hey," she called, her voice steady but firm. "What are you doing here?" The figure didn't respond at first, just standing there in the dim light. Then, as Eliza got closer, the figure finally stepped into the light. It was a man, tall and wiry, with a face she didn't recognize. His clothes were nondescript, and there was an unsettling calm to his presence. He wasn't armed, but Eliza wasn't about to make assumptions. "I've been waiting for you," the man said, his voice low but clear. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. "Waiting for me?" she repeated, a chill creeping down her spine. The man nodded slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You've been asking the wrong questions, Eliza. And you've been making some powerful people nervous." Eliza's grip on her gun tightened. "Who are you?" The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Let's just say I work for people who have a vested interest in making sure you don't dig any deeper into this. Ford's not someone you want to cross. He's connected to things you can't even begin to understand. If you're smart, you'll walk away." Eliza didn't flinch. "And if I don't?" The man's smile faded, and his eyes hardened. "Then you'll regret it." Before Eliza could respond, the man turned and walked into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Who was he? What was he trying to warn her about? And what did he mean by making powerful people nervous? Eliza returned to the truck, her mind on high alert. Lena was already out of the vehicle, her eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger. "What was that about?" Lena asked, her tone low but urgent. Eliza shook her head, her thoughts spinning. "I don't know, but whoever he works for, they don't want us digging any deeper. And I think it's time we did exactly that." Lena's expression hardened. "If they want us to stop, then we're on the right track." Eliza nodded, the weight of the warning hanging heavily in the air. They were in deeper now, tangled in a web that stretched farther than they could have imagined. But Eliza wasn't about to back down. The fight for Deadwood Ridge was far from over. And the truth, no matter how dangerous it was, would be exposed. The quiet of Deadwood Ridge was now fractured, shattered by the appearance of the mysterious man and the warnings he had delivered. Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was looming on the horizon. The town, which had been recovering from the chaos of the Black Riders, now found itself at the center of a far more dangerous game. And Eliza was no longer just a player in that game. She was a target. The sun was low in the sky as Eliza parked the truck outside the ranch, the weight of everything she had just learned pressing heavily on her chest. The cryptic warning, the mention of Ford, the unnamed powers pulling strings from the shadows. It was all too much, but it was all connected, and Eliza was determined to piece it together, no matter the cost. Lena was quiet beside her, clearly thinking the same thing. She knew the risks just as well as Eliza did, but there was something about this situation that felt different, more dangerous. If Ford and his people were watching her, it was only a matter of time before they made their move. "We need to move fast," Eliza said, breaking the silence. "If we wait too long, they'll close in on us before we even have a chance to figure out what they want." Lena nodded, her jaw tight. "And if they're watching you, they know we're not backing down. This won't end quietly." Eliza didn't need to say more. They had always known that the deeper they dug into the criminal network, the more dangerous it would become. But this felt like it was about to reach its tipping point. If they didn't act, they'd be swallowed up by the very forces they were trying to fight. As Eliza stepped out of the truck, she spotted her father standing on the porch of the ranch house, his face drawn with worry. He had always been a man of few words, but the last few days had aged him. The toll of the battle, the Black Riders, and now the threat of something far darker. It was wearing on him. "Eliza," he said, his voice rough but steady. "We need to talk." Eliza walked up to the porch, her steps slow, deliberate. She could feel the weight of the conversation before it even began. Her father was never one to show his concerns so openly, but there was something in his eyes now. Something that told her he had been keeping things from her. "What is it, Dad?" Eliza asked, trying to keep her tone even. Bill Hayes took a long breath, his hands clenched at his sides. "I don't know how to say this, but I've been hearing things. People in town, people I trust, are talking. They've been saying there's been an increase in activity around here. Not just from the bikers, but from others. People who don't belong." Eliza's heart sank. She had feared this. The Black Riders had been just the beginning. And now, whoever was behind them, the ones pulling the strings, were starting to make their presence known. "I've heard whispers of names, Eliza," Bill continued. "People tied to Ford. And there's talk that someone wants the land."
Our land.
Eliza's stomach churned. The land, Deadwood Ridge, her family's home, was more than just property. It was everything. It was her past, her future. It was the place where she had learned to fight, to survive, to protect. "Who's behind it, Dad?" Eliza asked, her voice tight. "Who are these people?" Bill's gaze darkened, his face tense with the weight of the answer. "I don't know for sure, but whoever they are, they've got enough power to make things happen. People in positions of authority are being bought off. Law enforcement, even some of the ranchers. It's bigger than we thought." Eliza turned away from him, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her family anymore. This was about everything she had fought to protect. Ford, whoever he was, had made it clear that Deadwood Ridge was on his radar. And if he wanted the land, he would stop at nothing to take it. "I need to get to the bottom of this," Eliza said, more to herself than to her father. "If these people want the land, they're going to have to go through me first." Bill stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I don't want you to go down that road, Eliza. You're my daughter. This fight, it's not something I want for you, but I can see it in your eyes. You're not going to stop, are you?" Eliza met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "No, I'm not." Bill let out a long breath and nodded. "Then be careful. There are forces out there you don't understand, and they'll do anything to get what they want." Eliza's expression softened for a moment, the weight of her father's words sinking in. But she couldn't stop now. Not when so many people were counting on her. Not when Deadwood Ridge itself was hanging by a thread. After a moment of silence, Eliza turned back to Lena, who had been standing quietly nearby, listening to the conversation unfold. The look in her eyes was resolute, just as determined as Eliza was. "We're going after Ford," Eliza said, her voice steady. "We need to find out who's behind him. We need to stop this before it destroys everything we've worked for." Lena gave her a sharp nod. "You're not doing this alone. I'm with you. Always." With that, Eliza knew there was no turning back. The town had already seen its fair share of bloodshed, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about taking the fight to those who wanted to tear it all down. And this time, they wouldn't just be defending their home. They would be taking the fight to the enemy. Eliza and Lena made their way to the old town hall, where they had set up a temporary base of operations. The room was filled with maps, files, and notes, a chaotic collection of information that they had been piecing together for days. But it was all leading them in one direction: Ford. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. "We need to find him," Eliza said, as she studied the papers spread out on the table. "We need to find out who he's working with and where he's hiding. The longer we wait, the more powerful this network becomes." Lena nodded, already flipping through some of the files. "We've got contacts. I'll reach out to some of the guys I know who might have information. If Ford's operating this close to town, someone has seen him." Eliza exhaled slowly, her mind focused on the task at hand. "Good. Let's move. This time, we take the fight to them." As she stood up, her eyes scanned the room, taking in the weight of the moment. She had promised to protect Deadwood Ridge, but what she was about to face would push her to the limit, against an enemy that had no mercy, no hesitation, and she would stop at nothing to ensure that they never got their hands on her home. The walls of the town hall were lined with maps, photographs, and scribbled notes. Eliza stood at the front of the room, her gaze fixed on the intricate web of connections laid out before her. Every piece of information they had gathered in the past few days seemed to fit into place, but the full picture was still blurry. Every lead felt like it was leading her toward the same conclusion. Someone powerful was pulling the strings, and Evan Ford was merely the front. Lena stood beside her, quietly reviewing the latest intel they had pulled together. Eliza could feel the tension in the air, an electricity that hadn't been there before. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about saving Deadwood Ridge anymore. It was about exposing a network so deep and insidious that even those in power were in its grip. "Ford's not the man at the top," Lena said, her voice low but firm, breaking the silence. "He's just the hammer. Someone's got him working for them. Someone bigger." "I know," Eliza replied, her eyes scanning the notes on the table. "But who? Who's really behind this?" Lena frowned, picking up a folder from the corner of the desk. It was one of the ones they'd just received, marked with the name Evan Ford scrawled across the top in bold letters. She flipped it open, her finger tracing a line of connections that Eliza had missed before. "There's a name here that keeps popping up," Lena said, her finger landing on a page. "William Crawford." Eliza's pulse quickened at the mention of the name. She'd heard whispers of Crawford before, rumors that seemed too dangerous to believe. But as she stared at the page, the details became harder to ignore. William Crawford was a name tied to many of the operations in the area, more than she had realized. The man had connections in business, politics, and law enforcement. His name appeared in the background of nearly every shady deal in the region, like a shadow that stretched across everything. "William Crawford," Eliza repeated, her voice low. "I've heard of him, but it's just whispers. No one talks about him openly. He's too powerful." Lena glanced up at her, her expression tight with understanding. "He's got the right connections. And Ford's the muscle. Crawford's the one pulling the strings. If we go after Ford, we're going after Crawford." Eliza nodded, a sense of certainty filling her. She had been chasing shadows, but this was the heart of the operation. Crawford was the man who had to be stopped if they had any hope of dismantling the network that had its claws in Deadwood Ridge. "We need to find him," Eliza said firmly. "We need to know where he's hiding. And we need to make sure he doesn't get away this time." Lena leaned in closer, her voice almost a whisper. "We can't just show up at his door, Eliza. Crawford's not someone who leaves a trail. He's too good at covering his tracks." "I know," Eliza said, her mind racing, "but we'll find him. He's been pulling strings for too long. He can't hide forever." They spent the next few hours poring over the information, trying to connect the final pieces. Every name, every location, every transaction. They were all linked in some way to Crawford. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Eliza knew that by going after Crawford, they were stepping into the lion's den. He had the resources to make them disappear, to silence anyone who threatened him. As the night wore on, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. They had been careful, but Ford's network was too vast. They couldn't wait much longer. If Crawford was pulling the strings, then he had to know that they were getting closer. They couldn't let him get away. "Not now. Let's move," Eliza said, standing up and grabbing her coat. "We don't have time to waste." Lena nodded, already gathering her things. "Where do we start?" "We start with Crawford's known associates," Eliza replied, a plan beginning to form in her mind. "There are people who know him, who've worked with him. We find them, we get them to talk. It's time to turn the tables." As they left the town hall and stepped into the cold night air, Eliza's mind was a whirlwind of strategy and possibilities. She knew they had one shot at this. If they could get close enough to Crawford, they could end this. But they had to be careful. If they weren't, it could be the last mistake they ever made. They began with the people who had been seen coming in and out of Crawford's known properties. People who had slipped under the radar for years, whose names had never made the papers but were connected to high-profile deals, smuggling, money laundering, and other illicit activities. These were the people who held the key to finding Crawford, to finally shutting down his operation. By the time they made their first contact, Eliza could already feel the danger closing in. The man they spoke to, a former associate of Crawford's named Richard, was nervous, paranoid. His eyes darted around the room, his voice shaking as he spoke. I don't know anything about Crawford, Richard stammered. I'm just a middleman. I don't know where he is. I swear, I haven't seen him in months. He keeps a low profile, too low for anyone to find. But Eliza wasn't deterred. She leaned in, her gaze intense. I don't think you're telling me everything, Richard. You know something. And if you don't tell me, I'll make sure you regret it. Lena stepped closer, her presence steadying Eliza, but also adding a layer of quiet menace to the conversation. We're not leaving until you talk. Richard trembled, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. All right. I know he's been laying low in the hills. He's got a place up north, near the old mines. But you didn't hear it from me. He'll kill me if he finds out. Eliza's heart raced as she absorbed the information. They had a lead. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to find Crawford. Enough to take him down. Thank you, Richard, Eliza said, her voice cold as she stood up. You've been very helpful. Richard looked as if he might pass out from relief. I didn't say anything, all right? I didn't say anything. Please, just let me go. We're not done yet, Lena said, her voice calm but firm. We'll be keeping an eye on you. Don't forget that. As they walked out of the building, Eliza's mind raced. The location Richard had given them, the old mines in the hills, was isolated, remote, perfect for someone like Crawford to lay low without drawing attention. But it would also be a perfect trap. They had to be careful. They climbed into the truck, the weight of the mission pressing down on them. This is it, Eliza said, her voice steady but filled with the tension of what lay ahead. We're going after Crawford. This time, we finish it. Lena looked at her, the flicker of determination in her eyes. We'll do it, Eliza. We'll stop him. And with that, they turned the truck toward the hills. The final confrontation was waiting for them, and they were ready. The drive toward the old mines took longer than Eliza expected. The road twisted and turned through thick trees, the darkness making everything feel more isolated, more uncertain. The faint glow of their headlights was the only thing that cut through the blackness around them. Eliza's mind was sharp, focused. She couldn't afford to let her guard down now. Crawford was close, and they had one shot at this. If they didn't find him tonight, he would slip away again, and it would only be a matter of time before he struck back at Deadwood Ridge. As the truck bounced along the rugged path, Lena's eyes scanned the landscape ahead, her expression unreadable. We're getting close, she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. Eliza nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. They had already crossed into a more desolate part of the land, the kind of place where no one would think to look for someone like Crawford. The area was quiet, too quiet. No signs of life, no lights or movement. It was as though the hills had swallowed up everything around them. It feels wrong, doesn't it? Eliza said under her breath. Too easy. Lena didn't respond immediately, but Eliza could tell she was thinking the same thing. Something about this didn't sit right. This place felt like a trap, a place where someone could hide from the world and never be found. The hills surrounded them, like the jaws of some silent predator, waiting to snap shut. They reached the mouth of the old mine, a dilapidated structure that had long since stopped being a place of industry. Now, it stood as a decaying monument to forgotten labor, its rusting gates and sagging buildings looking more like a graveyard than a hideout. The faint smell of damp earth and decay clung to the air. Eliza killed the engine, and the truck rolled to a stop just outside the entrance. The moonlight cast long shadows over the scene, painting everything in hues of gray and silver. We're here, Eliza said softly. Her voice was steady, but she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Lena looked at her, her eyes sharp. I don't like this. It's too quiet. There's something off about this place. Eliza didn't argue. She felt it too, but they couldn't afford to back down now. They had come this far, and they couldn't afford to waste any more time. She nodded toward the mine's entrance. We go in. We stick to the plan. Quiet, fast, and get what we need. Lena's lips curled into a grim smile. And if Crawford's here? Then we end it, Eliza said, her voice low, determined. We don't give him the chance to escape again. They stepped out of the truck, moving with the quiet efficiency of soldiers on a mission. The night seemed to hold its breath as they approached the entrance of the mine, the heavy air pressing in around them. The wind had picked up, and Eliza could hear it rustling through the trees. Adding to the unease she felt crawling down her spine. They crept toward the entrance, Lena in the lead, Eliza following close behind. Their footsteps were muffled by the dirt and grass, but every step felt louder than the last. The mine loomed ahead like a gaping maw, swallowing up the light. They reached the door, which hung crookedly on its hinges, its rusted metal creaking under the slightest pressure. Eliza motioned for Lena to stop, then slowly pushed it open, just enough to slip inside. The air inside was stale and thick with dust. The faint smell of oil and machinery lingered in the shadows. The space was vast, the sound of their breathing the only thing that seemed to echo in the stillness. Eliza could see outlines of old mining equipment, shovels, carts, and rails long abandoned. But there were no signs of life, no sounds other than their own. Eliza moved deeper into the mine, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The further they went, the more the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It was too quiet, too still. And then, she heard it. A faint sound, like a low murmur, echoing through the mine. It was distant, but unmistakable. A voice, soft but unmistakable. Eliza motioned for Lena to stop, holding her hand up. The two of them froze, listening intently. There it was again. A low, almost inaudible hum. A conversation. It was coming from deeper inside the mine. "Crawford," Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible. Lena nodded, her eyes narrowing as she pulled out her sidearm. "Could be. Let's find out." They moved forward again, their steps more careful now, their bodies pressed close to the walls to stay hidden in the shadows. As they got closer to the sound, the murmur grew louder, until Eliza could make out the words, just enough to hear that Crawford wasn't alone. There were others. "We've got to move quickly. Hayes is onto us. She's too close. If we don't finish this now, everything could fall apart," a man's voice said, sharp and urgent. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. Hayes. They were talking about her, but they didn't know she was already here. Lena's eyes flicked to Eliza, a silent question passing between them. Should they confront them now? Eliza hesitated. "We wait. We listen. Get as much as we can before we make our move." Lena didn't argue, though she seemed to want to. They continued moving, staying out of sight, inching closer to the voices. The further they went, the more the conversation became clear. "She won't stop," the same voice said. "She's already figured out everything. We can't let her get to Crawford. We'll finish it here, before she can expose us. Deadwood Ridge has to fall." Eliza's stomach churned as the truth hit her. This wasn't just about taking the land. It was about controlling everything. The town, its people, and anyone who stood in their way. Crawford had been pulling the strings for far too long, and now, they were about to silence her, permanently. They were getting close now, close enough to see shadows moving in the distance, silhouettes against the dim light. Eliza could make out two figures, one taller than the other. Crawford. He was here. Lena's fingers tightened on her gun. Her eyes locked on Eliza's, asking for confirmation. Eliza's breath caught, her eyes never leaving the figures ahead. The moment of truth was here. They had come for Crawford, and now they would end it. She stepped forward, making the decision in an instant. "Now," Eliza whispered, and they sprang into action. The darkness of the mine felt like it was closing in around Eliza as she moved swiftly with Lena by her side. Their footsteps echoed softly through the cavernous space, the air thick with dust and the sharp scent of rusted metal. Every second felt like an eternity, and the weight of the moment pressed down on them both. Ahead, Eliza could make out two figures standing near the back of the mine, their conversation still low but clearly tense. She could see them more clearly now. One was tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably the man they had been tracking, Crawford. The other figure was shorter, leaning in as if listening to something important. Eliza's grip tightened around her knife, the cold steel a constant reminder of the stakes. Crawford was right there, within reach, but the danger was palpable. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not now, not when everything had led up to this. Lena moved in closer, her movements sharp and calculated. While Eliza stayed slightly behind, the shadows her ally. They were close now, close enough to hear the words coming from the men ahead. "This town is worth more than you think." Crawford's voice was smooth, calculated, tinged with the arrogance of someone who thought they were untouchable. "Once it's in our hands, there won't be anyone left to challenge us. Hayes won't stop us. Not when she doesn't know what we're really after." The second figure, a man with a hard face, nodded. "It's too late to turn back now. We'll take care of her before she figures out what's really going on." Eliza's pulse quickened. They had already anticipated her, already planned for her intervention. This wasn't just about land anymore. They had been building an empire, and Deadwood Ridge was just the beginning. But she wasn't about to let them win. She motioned for Lena to take the right side. Without a word, Lena nodded, her eyes sharp and focused. Eliza moved toward the left, closer to Crawford, careful not to make a sound. They would need to act fast. Eliza's heart pounded as she drew closer, her breath steady. She was almost there. She could feel the tension in the air, the danger of the moment hanging heavily in the space between them. She knew what was at stake, her town, her home, and she wasn't going to let these men destroy it. Crawford's voice rang out again, louder now, a hint of impatience in his tone. "I don't care what it takes. We eliminate anyone who stands in our way. Hayes is a liability, and I'm not going to let her ruin everything." That was it. They had gone too far. Eliza couldn't wait any longer. The time for stealth was over. With a quick motion, she sprang from her hiding spot, her footsteps silent on the ground as she charged toward Crawford. At the same moment, Lena moved in from the right, flanking the other man. "Crawford!" Eliza shouted, her voice cutting through the tension. The surprise on Crawford's face was immediate. He turned just as Eliza reached him, but she was faster. With one swift motion, she grabbed him by the collar, pulling him forward with all her strength, using his own momentum against him. The knife was at his throat before he could react. "Don't move," Eliza growled, her voice low and steady, her grip firm on his jacket. "I'm not here to negotiate. You're done." Crawford's eyes flashed with disbelief, then narrowed into a cold, calculating glare. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Hayes," he spat. "You're playing a dangerous game. This isn't just about you. It's bigger than you, bigger than this town." Lena's voice cut through the air, sharp and focused as she approached the other figure, who had reached for his weapon. "Drop it," she commanded, her gun aimed directly at his chest. "This ends now." The man hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered his weapon, his eyes flicking between Eliza and Lena. He knew he was outmatched. "Eliza, you've already lost," Crawford sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can stop this? You think you can stop me? I have connections, power, people who will make sure this town bends to my will. You've already made your move, but it's too late. They'll come for you. You'll never win." Eliza's grip on her knife tightened as she glared at Crawford, her face hardening. "You underestimate me," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "You underestimate Deadwood Ridge. And you're not getting away with this." Lena stepped closer, keeping her eyes on the other man, who had now surrendered. "We don't need your empire, Crawford. And we're not backing down." The air was thick with tension as the two men stood still, their lives now hanging by a thread. Crawford's smirk faded as he realized the gravity of his situation. The tables had turned. Deadwood Ridge wasn't just a pawn in his game anymore. It was a force to be reckoned with. Eliza's mind raced with the consequences of their actions. They had the upper hand now, but Crawford was not someone who would go down quietly. He still had influence, still had resources. But they had him cornered, and they weren't letting him escape. "Call it in," Eliza ordered Lena, her voice calm but firm. "We need to get him out of here, fast." Lena pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly as she made the call to the authorities. Eliza kept her gaze locked on Crawford, unwilling to let him out of her sight. The man had been a shadow, a ghost, manipulating everything from the background. But now, the shadows were closing in on him, and he would be forced to face the consequences of his actions. Eliza stood tall, her breath slow and controlled, but her heart still pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment they had fought for. The town, her home, was safe, for now. But the battle wasn't over. The war had only just begun. Crawford may have been taken down, but there were always more threats, more darkness lurking just beyond the horizon. Eliza knew this was just one chapter in a much larger story. But for tonight, Deadwood Ridge had one. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow across the rugged hills surrounding Deadwood Ridge. The air was still, calm, deceptively so. After the chaos of the past few days, Eliza couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. They had taken Crawford down. They had finally cornered the man who had been pulling the strings, who had been orchestrating the quiet war on her town. But as the authorities arrived to secure the area and take Crawford into custody, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The dust from the mine had settled, but it still hung thick in her mind, clouding her thoughts. Crawford may have been arrested, but his network, his empire, was vast. His connections stretched far beyond Deadwood Ridge, and Eliza knew that one man's capture wouldn't end the fight. She could feel the tension rising, thick in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Lena had stayed close by, her hand on the butt of her gun as the last of the law enforcement vehicles drove away from the mine. Crawford had been quiet after the confrontation. He hadn't tried to escape, hadn't put up a fight. His arrogance had crumbled in the face of reality. But Eliza wasn't fooled. She knew that Crawford's capture was only the beginning of unraveling the truth. The question now was, what else had he been hiding? Who else was involved? Eliza, Lena said quietly, pulling her from her thoughts. We did it. We took down the man behind it all. Eliza nodded, but there was no triumph in her eyes. She knew better than to celebrate too soon. Yeah, we did. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. Lena glanced at her, her brow furrowing. What do you mean? Crawford was just one piece, Eliza said, her voice low but filled with a resolve that came from experience. There's more out there. People who think they can control everything. Deadwood Ridge, the land, the people. Crawford was just a cog in the machine. But now that we've exposed him, we need to follow the trail to the people behind him. Lena gave a single nod, her face hardening. You're right. There's always more. And they'll be coming for us soon. Eliza's gaze hardened as she looked out across the hills, the town of Deadwood Ridge barely visible in the distance. The battle might have been won, but the war wasn't over. There would be others, people who were just as dangerous, just as determined as Crawford had been to keep their hold on this town. And as much as Eliza wanted to believe that everything could go back to normal, she knew better. The town had been in danger for too long, and now, it was her job to make sure that they would never have to face something like this again. We'll be ready, Eliza said finally, her voice low and steady. But I need to know everything Crawford was hiding. We need to dig deeper. If there's a network, we find it. We take it down. Lena studied her for a moment, then nodded once again, her expression unwavering. I'm with you. We do this together. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Eliza turned and walked back toward the truck, her thoughts already on the next steps. There were still so many unanswered questions. Why had Crawford come to Deadwood Ridge in the first place? What had he been after? And who had been working with him? These were the questions that gnawed at Eliza, questions that couldn't be ignored. They were all threads in a larger web, a web that she had to unravel before it strangled everything she held dear. Back at the ranch house, the mood was subdued, the weight of the victory still hanging in the air. Bill Hayes sat in his old chair on the porch, his hands folded in front of him as he watched Eliza approach. She could see the concern etched into his face, the exhaustion that had settled in his shoulders. Eliza, Bill said as she walked up to him. His voice was rough, but there was something softer in it than usual. You've been through a lot. The whole town has. And now that Crawford's gone, maybe it's time to take a step back. Maybe it's time to rest. Eliza hesitated before sitting beside him, looking out over the ranch. She could feel the weight of her father's words. Rest. A luxury she hadn't had time for in weeks. But now, with Crawford behind bars, with the immediate threat gone, maybe, just maybe, she could take a moment to breathe. I wish I could, Dad, Eliza said, her voice heavy with fatigue. But I can't. Not yet. There's too much at stake. Bill turned his head slightly, his gaze softening. "You've done more than anyone could have asked, Eliza. You've brought this town back from the brink. But you've got to remember, there's more to life than fighting. You've got a future here. Don't lose sight of that." Eliza bit her lip, considering her father's words. The town had been saved, for now, but her job was far from done. She had always been driven by the need to protect her home, to make sure no one could ever threaten it again. But as she sat there with her father, she felt the weight of the decision that lay ahead. Could she really step away, even for a moment? Or was the war just beginning? "I'll never stop protecting this town," Eliza said quietly, her voice filled with quiet determination. "But I promise you, I won't lose sight of what matters. I won't let this consume me." Bill nodded, his weathered face filled with pride. "I know you won't." The next few days were a blur of meetings and follow-ups. Eliza and Lena had reached out to their contacts, trying to piece together the last remaining details of Crawford's network. They didn't get far, but the silence that followed only confirmed what Eliza feared. Crawford's people were in hiding. The more she tried to dig, the more they pulled back. Whoever was behind him was already moving to cover their tracks. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the town settled into an uneasy peace, Eliza received an unexpected visitor. A woman. She stood at the edge of the ranch, her figure cloaked in shadow. Eliza had seen her before, but only from a distance. A tall, striking woman who had been in town during the chaos, but had never made her presence known. There was something about her that felt off. The woman stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking against the dirt as she approached Eliza, her eyes gleaming in the fading light. "I've been waiting for you," the woman said, her voice smooth and measured. Eliza's pulse quickened as she stared at the stranger. "Who are you?" The woman smiled coldly, her eyes never leaving Eliza's. "Someone you don't want to ignore. And someone who knows exactly what you're trying to do." Eliza's stomach twisted. The game had changed again, and now she had a new enemy to face. The woman's presence was unsettling, her calm demeanor almost unnatural as she stood on the edge of the porch, silhouetted against the dimming sky. Eliza's instincts screamed at her to be wary. This wasn't someone who had just wandered into town. No, this woman had purpose, and that purpose was clearly tied to the ongoing battle for Deadwood Ridge. Eliza didn't move, her posture tense but poised. She had learned long ago not to show fear, especially not to someone who seemed so confident in their power. "You've been waiting for me?" Eliza's voice was steady, but beneath the calm, she was already calculating her next move. She didn't know who this woman was, but she could feel the weight of her words. There was no such thing as a coincidence, not when it came to someone like Eliza. The woman smiled, a slow, calculating grin that made Eliza's skin crawl. "You've been busy, haven't you? Digging into things you don't understand. Looking for enemies where there may not even be one." She stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden steps. "But I'm not here to fight you, Eliza Hayes." Eliza didn't trust her. "Then why are you here?" The woman stopped just a few feet away, her eyes scanning Eliza's face, studying her like she was some puzzle waiting to be solved. "Because you're on the wrong side of this fight. And if you continue to dig, if you keep pushing, I'm afraid you're going to end up in way over your head." Eliza's brow furrowed as she took in the woman's words. Wrong side? Over her head? It was becoming clear that whoever she was dealing with wasn't just a random figure in the shadows. This woman was connected to something bigger, something far more dangerous than Eliza had been prepared for. "I don't need a lecture," Eliza said, her voice hardening. "I've seen enough to know what's going on here. Crawford's gone, but I know there's more to this. Whoever you are, whatever you think you're going to do, I won't back down." The woman's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm not here to give you a choice. I'm here to warn you, because the people you're trying to bring down, they're too big for you to fight alone." Eliza stepped forward, her chin lifting in defiance. "I don't fight alone." "Of course you don't," the woman said, her voice dropping into a whisper. "But even with your friends, even with all the help you've got, you're nothing against the forces that control this town. You've been fighting a small war, Eliza, but the real war? The one that matters? It's much bigger. And unless you want your little town to be crushed underfoot, You need to stop.
Now.
Eliza's eyes narrowed. There was something familiar about the woman's cold, calculated tone. It wasn't a warning from someone afraid of her. It was a warning from someone who was untouchable. This woman wasn't some random enforcer. She was someone powerful, someone who had been watching from the shadows for far longer than Eliza had even realized. Who are you? Eliza asked again, her voice sharper now. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step closer, her eyes locking onto Eliza's with a cold, knowing stare. You'll find out soon enough. But by then, it'll be too late. Before Eliza could respond, the woman turned on her heel and began walking away, her steps slow but deliberate. Eliza stood frozen for a moment, watching her retreat into the shadows, her mind racing. This wasn't just a random threat. It was calculated. A message. A warning. Eliza, are you all right? Lena's voice broke through the tension, and Eliza turned to find her standing at the edge of the porch, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. I'm fine, Eliza replied, though she could feel the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air. But I think we've just made a very dangerous enemy. Lena's eyes flicked to where the woman had disappeared into the dark, her expression hardening. Who was that? I don't know, Eliza admitted, but she's not someone I can ignore. She's tied to something much bigger than Crawford. She's connected to the forces controlling this town, and she knows too much. Lena took a step forward, her jaw tight with determination. Then we need to find out who she is, and fast. If they're that organized, we won't have much time before they make their move. Eliza nodded, but the uneasy feeling in her gut remained. She had thought she had the upper hand, that taking down Crawford had dealt a heavy blow to the network threatening Deadwood Ridge. But now, with the appearance of this woman, this mysterious figure who knew too much, Eliza realized that the war was far from over. It had only escalated. We'll find her, Eliza said, her voice filled with determination, and we'll bring down whoever is behind this. But we have to be smarter. We have to dig deeper. Lena gave her a knowing look. We're not stopping now. We can't. This town depends on us. The following days were filled with a sense of urgency. Eliza and Lena doubled down on their efforts to uncover more about the woman who had visited Eliza. They reached out to every contact they could think of, pushing harder to uncover the woman's identity, trying to follow any thread that could lead them to the people behind her. But the deeper they dug, the more the shadows seemed to swallow them up. It was as though this new enemy had already covered her tracks, and no matter how hard they searched, they couldn't find a single trace. But Eliza wasn't ready to back down. She couldn't afford to. Too many people depended on her to protect Deadwood Ridge, and she had learned, through countless battles, that there was no rest when you were fighting for something worth saving. They weren't just dealing with a criminal network anymore. They were up against an invisible enemy, a force that operated in the shadows, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And Eliza Hayes wasn't going to stop until she had exposed them all, no matter the cost. Late one night, after another fruitless round of investigation, Eliza received an unexpected call. It was a number she didn't recognize, but there was something about it that sent a chill down her spine. Hello? Eliza answered, her voice steady despite the apprehension gnawing at her. A soft, almost familiar voice answered on the other end of the line. You've been asking the right questions, Eliza. But some questions are better left unanswered. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. It was her. The woman. I told you already, Eliza said, her voice tight with frustration. I'm not backing down. Who are you? Who's behind all of this? The woman's voice was calm, but there was a steel edge to it now. You've made your choice, and now you'll see the cost. The people you've been fighting for, they're not as safe as you think. If you don't stop, they'll suffer. The line went dead. Eliza stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, her pulse racing. This wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a promise, and she knew that if she wanted to protect Deadwood Ridge, she was going to have to face whatever was coming, head on. The weight of the woman's words echoed in Eliza's mind as she stood there, the phone still pressed against her ear. The call had been brief, but its message was clear. The danger wasn't just coming for her anymore. It was coming for the people she swore to protect, and if she didn't stop, they would suffer. She hung up the phone slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she set it down. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. Thoughts of the people of Deadwood Ridge, of her father, of everything she had fought to keep safe. This was no longer just a battle for survival. This was about something much bigger, something far darker. Lena had been standing nearby, her back to the door as she waited. She had heard the tension in Eliza's voice, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her as she stepped toward her. "What did she say?" Lena asked, her voice low, her eyes scanning Eliza's face for any sign of weakness. Eliza turned slowly to face her, her jaw set, her eyes hard. "She's threatening the people of Deadwood Ridge. She knows we're getting closer, Lena. She's warning me. If we keep going, if we keep digging into the network she's part of, the people we care about are going to pay the price." Lena's face hardened, her gaze unwavering. "Then we fight. We don't back down. That's what we've always done. We'll make sure she knows we're not afraid." Eliza shook her head, her mind spinning. "This isn't just about us anymore. This is bigger. Whoever she works for, they're untouchable. Powerful people with their hands in everything. We've still got the upper hand," Lena insisted, stepping forward. "We have the information. We have Crawford. We've already taken down a major part of their operation. We've got them on the ropes." "Not yet," Eliza said quietly, looking out the window toward the dimming horizon. "We haven't even scratched the surface. They'll come for us, harder than before." Lena's expression didn't waver. "And we'll be ready. We've been through worse. We'll get through this too." Eliza glanced at her, the fire in Lena's eyes matching her own. She appreciated Lena's resolve more than she could say. But deep down, Eliza knew the threat they were facing was unlike anything they'd encountered before. The battle wasn't just about taking down individuals. It was about dismantling an empire, one that spanned far beyond Deadwood Ridge. And with every move they made, the target on their backs grew larger. The next day, Eliza and Lena met with the remaining contacts they could trust. The authorities had been working to keep the peace in Deadwood Ridge, but Eliza had come to realize that the local law enforcement wasn't going to be enough to take down the kind of power Crawford and his people wielded. They needed more than just muscle. They needed strategy. They needed allies who could work from the inside, people with connections in the right places. The problem was, no one was going to risk their necks unless they could see the bigger picture. And for Eliza, that bigger picture was beginning to look darker by the hour. Eliza stood with Lena, arms crossed as she leaned against a wooden post outside the town hall. "We need to make our next move," she said, her tone firm. "We can't wait any longer. Crawford won't stay in custody for long. Someone will come for him. And when they do, we need to be ready." "I've got a few people lined up," Lena said, her voice steady. "People who know how to operate outside the system. But we need to act fast. I don't think Crawford's people are done with us." "You're right," Eliza replied. "And we're not done with them either." Just as Eliza was about to continue, a vehicle pulled up in front of the town hall. She froze as the door opened, revealing a figure she hadn't expected to see, her father. He walked toward her, his face drawn, his expression tight with concern. "Dad?" Eliza asked, her voice soft but tinged with confusion. "What are you doing here?" Bill Hayes stopped just in front of her, looking her up and down with a mix of concern and pride. "I've been hearing things," he said, his voice low, "about people making moves in town, about your fight. I just wanted to make sure you know what you're up against. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about everyone who lives here." Eliza sighed, her chest tight. "I know, Dad. I'm doing everything I can to protect this town, but I need more than just muscle. I need information. I need help." Bill nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "You've got it. I may not have the connections you need, but I've lived here long enough to know the people who have." Eliza blinked, surprised. "You're willing to help?" Her father's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Of course. But this is bigger than you think, Eliza. The people you're up against, they're not just dangerous. They're ruthless. You don't know how far their reach goes." "I'm finding that out," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the weight of her father's words. "And I'm not backing down." Bill placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but gentle. "I know you're not. But be careful, Eliza. If you get too close to this, you might not be able to walk away. Eliza felt a pang of guilt in her chest, but she pushed it down. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to let anyone, especially her father, bear the consequences of it. I won't walk away, she said softly, looking up at him. But thank you. Bill gave her a small smile, his eyes full of love and concern. You're strong, Eliza. Just don't let that strength blind you to the bigger picture. As her father turned to leave, Eliza watched him go, a part of her torn between the weight of her responsibilities and the desire to protect the people she loved. This fight was bigger than just the Black Riders, bigger than Crawford. There were forces in play here that Eliza didn't fully understand, and every day, they seemed to grow more dangerous. Lena placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder, breaking her from her thoughts. We'll get through this. We always do. Eliza looked at her friend, her unwavering ally, and felt a surge of gratitude. Yeah, we will. Together. They stood there for a moment, the weight of their shared resolve filling the space between them. There were still so many unknowns. But one thing was certain, Deadwood Ridge wasn't going down without a fight. And neither was Eliza Hayes. The sun had barely risen the following day when Eliza stood once again at the edge of the ranch, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. The morning light bathed the land in a golden hue, but Eliza couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her insides. Deadwood Ridge had become a battleground, a place where secrets ran deep, and every move she made was shadowed by enemies she couldn't fully see. The presence of the mysterious woman, the warnings, and the unsettling call she had received the night before had left her with a sense of dread that hung like a cloud over everything. Lena approached her from behind, her boots crunching softly against the dirt. Eliza didn't turn to look, but she knew she didn't need to. She could feel Lena's presence like a constant, unwavering force. The weight of everything had started to press down on them both, but they weren't backing down. Not yet. We're not alone in this, Lena said softly, her tone serious. You know that, right? We've got more allies than we realize. You're not in this fight by yourself. Eliza finally turned to face her, the intensity in her eyes matching Lena's. I know, but the harder we push, the more dangerous this becomes. Whoever is behind Crawford, whoever's controlling everything. They're playing a game I don't understand yet. Lena nodded, her eyes scanning the surrounding land before locking onto Eliza again. We'll figure it out, piece by piece. A heavy silence settled between them, each of them lost in their thoughts. The reality of their situation was starting to feel more like a storm on the horizon, inevitable, powerful, and threatening everything in its path. Eliza had already lost too much to let Deadwood Ridge fall under the control of whoever was pulling the strings. But the deeper she dug, the darker the world seemed to get. The two women walked back toward the ranch house, where Bill Hayes was waiting. His presence was a steady reminder of what was at stake. As much as Eliza wanted to protect him, she knew that it was impossible to shield everyone. Not in a fight like this. Bill stood on the porch, his hands resting on the railing as he gazed out at the horizon. There was a look in his eyes, a mixture of concern and weariness that had become more pronounced over the last few weeks. He had always been the rock of Deadwood Ridge, but Eliza could see that even he was beginning to feel the weight of everything happening around them. Eliza, Bill said, his voice hoarse with the exhaustion that had started to take root in his bones. There's someone here to see you. Eliza's brow furrowed in confusion. Who? Bill motioned toward the edge of the property, where a car had parked near the gate. I don't know, but they've been asking about you. They seem to think you're the one to talk to. Eliza exchanged a look with Lena, both of them silently agreeing that whatever this was, it couldn't be good. There were too many moving pieces, and every new face seemed to complicate the already dangerous puzzle they were trying to solve. They approached the gate, and as they got closer, Eliza saw a man standing beside the car. He was dressed sharply, too sharply for the rugged environment of Deadwood Ridge. His suit was immaculate, and his posture was rigid, businesslike, but with an air of superiority that immediately put Eliza on edge. I'm here to speak with Eliza Hayes, the man said, his voice smooth and authoritative. There was an unsettling calm in his demeanor, the kind that comes with knowing how to get exactly what you want. Eliza didn't speak immediately. She studied the man, trying to get a sense of who he was and what he was after. "And who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease tightening in her chest. The man smiled, but it was a cold, calculating smile. "My name is Samuel Carter. Let's say I'm someone with a vested interest in how things unfold here." Lena stepped forward, her stance protective. "What do you want?" Carter's eyes flicked over to Lena before returning to Eliza. "I've been sent to offer you a proposition, a chance to avoid unnecessary conflict, to find a solution to all this. A way out, if you will." Eliza's brow furrowed. "A way out?" "Yes," Carter said, his tone almost sympathetic. "You've been fighting hard, Eliza, but sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight with ourselves. The people you're up against, they're far more dangerous than you realize. If you continue down this path, it's not just you that will suffer. You'll bring everyone down with you." Eliza narrowed her eyes. "I'm not afraid of you." Carter's expression remained unchanged, but there was something unsettling in his gaze. "I'm not trying to intimidate you, Eliza. I'm here to help you avoid a much larger catastrophe. The people behind Crawford, they're not just criminals. They're an entire network with far-reaching influence, and they've been building this empire for years. If you keep digging, you'll find yourself in way over your head. And when you do, it won't just be your life at risk." Lena stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "So, what? You want to offer us a deal?" Carter's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Not a deal. A choice. I can give you the chance to walk away. Leave it all behind, and you can go back to your life here. No more threats. No more danger." Eliza's eyes burned with defiance. "And if I don't? If I don't just turn my back on this town and let people like you take control?" Carter's smile widened, but there was a darkness behind it now. "Then you'll make an enemy of forces far more powerful than you can imagine. People who won't hesitate to destroy everything you've worked for." The air was thick with tension, the weight of his words settling over Eliza like a stone. She could feel the danger, feel the pressure mounting on her, but she wasn't ready to back down, not when so much was at stake. "I'll make my own path," Eliza said, her voice unwavering. "And no one, not even you, will stop me from protecting Deadwood Ridge." Carter didn't respond immediately. He seemed to study her for a moment, as if weighing her resolve. Then, he turned toward the car, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said softly. "I warned you. I can't say I didn't." With that, he climbed into the car and drove away, leaving Eliza and Lena standing at the gate, the weight of the encounter sinking in. Lena looked at Eliza, her eyes filled with understanding. "You made the right choice." Eliza didn't answer right away. She stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear into the distance, her heart pounding in her chest. The enemy was no longer just a shadow in the background. They were moving, and they were willing to do whatever it took to win. But Eliza wasn't about to let them take this town. Not without a fight. The encounter with Samuel Carter had shaken Eliza more than she let on. His smooth words, the promise of safety, the veiled threat hanging in the air. Everything about the conversation left a gnawing discomfort in her gut. It wasn't just a warning. It was an ultimatum. Walk away, or face the full wrath of forces beyond her control. But walking away was never an option for Eliza. Not now. Not after everything she had fought for. Deadwood Ridge was more than just a town. It was her home, her responsibility, and no one, not even powerful men like Carter, could take that from her. She stood there for a long moment, watching the dust settle as Carter's car disappeared into the distance. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the ranch. Lena was beside her, her gaze unreadable, but Eliza knew that she wasn't alone. Lena had stood by her through every fight, and that wasn't going to change now. "You think he's serious?" Lena asked, her voice steady, though the same unease Eliza felt lingered in her words. "He's not the kind of man who wastes time with empty threats," Eliza replied, her voice tight. "But that's exactly what makes him dangerous. He's not just a middleman. He's a player in a much bigger game. And we're caught right in the middle of it." Lena nodded, her expression hardening. "Then we go after them. We expose them all. Whoever's behind Crawford, whoever's pulling the strings, they've got to be stopped. Now, before they can do any more damage, Eliza took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the task ahead. This wasn't just about protecting the land anymore. This was about tearing down an empire of corruption. And with each move they made, they were digging deeper into a network that didn't just control Deadwood Ridge. It controlled everything around it. "There's one thing I know for sure," Eliza said, her voice resolute. "We're not backing down. Not now. Not ever." The days that followed were filled with tension and urgency. Eliza and Lena reached out to their remaining contacts, trying to gather every piece of information they could about the network Samuel Carter had alluded to. But the deeper they dug, the more elusive their targets became. They followed leads that vanished into thin air. They questioned people who either didn't know or refused to talk. Whoever was behind this was powerful, too powerful for their small town to take on without help. Eliza had never been one to ask for assistance, but she realized now that they needed more than just their own resources to win this fight. They needed allies, people who could move in the shadows, people who understood the complex systems of power that ran through the veins of the criminal network they were up against. That night, Eliza and Lena sat in the town hall, surrounded by maps and documents, trying to piece together their next move. Eliza's eyes burned with exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. The network was closing in, and they had to move before it enveloped them completely. "We need someone on the inside," Eliza said, rubbing her temples. "Someone who can get us information about Carter's operation without raising suspicion." Lena leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she thought. "I know a guy. He's ex-military, retired, but he has contacts in the city. He's been working with the government for years. He's got the right connections to help us get to the people behind Crawford." Eliza looked up, intrigued. "What's his name?" "Vincent Hayes," Lena said. "He's been off the grid for a while, but I can reach out. He knows how to navigate this kind of thing. If anyone can help us get to Carter, it's him." Eliza nodded slowly. "We can't afford to waste any more time. Get him in contact with us. We need him now." The next day, Lena was on the phone, speaking with Vincent Hayes. Eliza sat at the table, her hands folded in front of her, staring at the map of Deadwood Ridge. She could feel the weight of the coming days pressing down on her. Time was running out. Crawford was in custody, but there were bigger forces at play. Forces that wanted control, that wouldn't hesitate to take the town if they had the chance. As Lena hung up the phone, she gave Eliza a knowing look. "He's in. He'll meet us tonight, at the old diner just outside of town." Eliza stood, determination hardening her features. "Good. Let's go." The diner was a small, nondescript place on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that most people drove by without a second glance. It was just the sort of place they needed for a meeting like this. Off the radar, out of sight. Eliza and Lena arrived early, taking a seat at a corner booth, waiting for Vincent to show. It wasn't long before the door opened, and a man stepped inside. A tall, broad-shouldered figure in a well-worn jacket and jeans. He had the kind of presence that made people stop and take notice, his eyes scanning the room with the sharpness of someone who had seen it all. When he spotted Eliza and Lena, he made his way toward their booth, his expression unreadable. Vincent Hayes slid into the seat across from them, his eyes scanning both women as he leaned back, his arms crossing over his chest. "You're the ones stirring up trouble in Deadwood Ridge," he said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. Eliza studied him for a moment, assessing the man before her. He was exactly what they needed. Someone with experience, someone who understood how to move within the shadows. "You know why we're here," Eliza said, her voice steady. "We need information. We need to find out who's behind the network that Crawford was a part of. We need to take them down before they have a chance to destroy everything we've worked for." Vincent raised an eyebrow but didn't hesitate. "I've been keeping an eye on things in this town, and I know that Crawford wasn't just a small-time player. Whoever's pulling the strings is far more dangerous than you realize. I've had dealings with people like them before, people who don't hesitate to eliminate anyone who gets in their way." Eliza's grip on the table tightened. "That's why we need you. We need someone who knows how to get us inside, someone who can help us get to the core of this operation." Vincent studied her for a moment, weighing the decision. Finally, he nodded. "I'll help you. But this isn't going to be easy. You're not just fighting a criminal network, you're fighting an empire. And empires don't fall without a fight." Eliza's voice hardened with resolve. "We're ready." As Vincent leaned forward, he began to outline a plan, a strategy that would allow them to infiltrate the network. They would have to move carefully, strategically, using the right contacts and gathering information piece by piece. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only option they had left. For the first time in days, Eliza felt a spark of hope. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The fight wasn't over, but with the right allies, they had a chance to win. And for Deadwood Ridge, she would fight to the very end. The night was still, the only sounds the distant rustle of leaves and the low hum of the wind. Eliza sat across from Vincent Hayes in the corner of a rundown motel room, the dim light flickering above them as they reviewed their plan. Every step had to be calculated. There was no room for error. Vincent leaned forward, his gruff voice cutting through the quiet. "This isn't going to be a quick job, Eliza. We're not just infiltrating some small-time operation. These people are connected to something much bigger. This network runs through law enforcement, through business, through politics. They've been operating under the radar for years." Eliza nodded, her jaw set. "I'm ready for whatever it takes. We can't let them keep running this town. We won't let them win." Lena sat quietly next to Eliza, her arms crossed, but the tension in her posture showed just how much was riding on this. The next few weeks would determine everything. If they failed now, the consequences would be disastrous, not just for Deadwood Ridge, but for every town connected to the empire that had been built in the shadows. "We start small," Vincent continued. "We gather intel, find out who's at the top of this chain. Then, we move in. We don't get greedy, don't get reckless. We take it slow." Eliza's gaze hardened, her mind already ticking through the next steps. Slow doesn't work when we're up against people who don't hesitate to eliminate anyone in their way. Vincent looked at her, a glint of understanding in his eyes. "You're right, but we can't go in guns blazing. We're up against powerful enemies. We need to strike when it counts. We've got to get close without alerting anyone." The plan was simple, but no part of it was easy. The first step would be to track down some of the smaller players, people who were involved in the operation but not yet on the radar of law enforcement. If they could get these people to talk, they would have a way in. And once they got inside, they would work their way up, piece by piece, until they found the mastermind behind the operation, the person who had been pulling all the strings. Eliza knew this wasn't going to be easy. Every lead they followed, every piece of information they uncovered, would bring them closer to the heart of the enemy's operation, and every step they took would increase the danger. But Eliza was prepared to do whatever it took. Her town had been threatened by forces she couldn't fully comprehend, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't backing down. Over the next few days, Eliza, Lena, and Vincent worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. The operation was vast, too vast for any one person to take down. But they were careful. They were patient. And as they made contact with people on the inside, the truth slowly began to reveal itself. The network Crawford had been a part of stretched far beyond Deadwood Ridge. It reached into the highest levels of power, all the way up to politicians and businessmen who had been using the town's resources for their own gain. One evening, after a long day of digging through files and tracking down leads, Lena sat down beside Eliza, a grim expression on her face. "I've been talking to some of my contacts. Some of the names they've given me, they're huge. People who are untouchable. We're not just dealing with local criminals. We're dealing with an organized network that controls everything." Eliza clenched her fists, the frustration starting to boil over. "I know, and it's exactly why we have to bring them down. We can't let them get away with this." Vincent, who had been reviewing a stack of documents at the table, looked up at them. "The deeper we go, the more dangerous this becomes. We need to tread carefully. They've got eyes everywhere." Eliza stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the dimly lit town below. The town she had fought to protect. The town that now seemed like a chessboard, with players who were far more skilled than she had anticipated. But she wasn't going to let them take it. Not now, not after everything they had been through. "We'll be careful," she said, her voice low but resolute. "But we can't wait forever. They've been controlling this town for too long, and it's time we took it back." The next day, the team moved forward with their plan. They had a lead on one of the smaller players, a businessman who was connected to the network but hadn't yet been investigated. His name was Charles Monroe, a man with a spotless reputation in public, but whose dealings in private had raised more than a few eyebrows. According to Vincent's contacts, Monroe had been involved in illegal land deals and smuggling operations for years, but no one had ever managed to pin anything on him. "Eliza, you're going to have to meet with him," Vincent said as they discussed the plan. "He's been in the game long enough that he'll know if we're coming at him too aggressively. He'll expect a softer approach." "I'll handle it," Eliza said, determination hardening her voice. "He won't see me coming." Lena gave her a pointed look. "Just be careful. He might play nice on the surface, but if he's connected to Crawford's people, he's not going to give up information easily." Eliza nodded. She knew the risks, but they couldn't afford to be careful anymore. They needed answers, and Monroe was the next piece of the puzzle. If they could get him to talk, they would be closer to taking down the entire operation. The meeting with Monroe took place in a small, upscale restaurant on the edge of town. The place was quiet, the kind of place where deals were made without a word spoken. As Eliza walked in, she immediately spotted Monroe sitting at a corner table, his back straight and his eyes scanning the room. He was a man who was used to being in control, used to having power over others. Eliza approached him with confidence, her step sure, her posture steady. She was dressed carefully, casually, but enough to show that she belonged in this world. Monroe glanced up as she approached, a faint smile appearing on his lips. "Eliza Hayes," he said, his voice smooth. "I wasn't expecting someone like you to come calling. Please sit." Eliza slid into the chair across from him, her gaze never leaving his. "You've been busy, Mr. Monroe. Too busy for someone with such a clean public image." Monroe's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of wariness in his eyes. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. You've been involved in land deals that don't add up," Eliza pressed. "You've been using your position to get away with things. But I'm not here to discuss your business dealings. I'm here to talk about Crawford." Monroe's expression shifted ever so slightly, but it was enough for Eliza to notice. She had his attention now. He knew exactly what she was getting at. "Crawford?" Monroe asked, his voice neutral. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Eliza. I don't know anything about the man you're talking about." Eliza leaned in, her gaze piercing. "I think you do. And I think you're involved in something much bigger than you're willing to admit. I need to know who's behind all of this. And I need you to tell me." For a long moment, Monroe didn't speak. Eliza could feel the tension in the air, the silent battle of wills between them. Finally, Monroe leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're playing a dangerous game, Eliza," he said quietly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Eliza didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of you." Monroe's smile returned, but this time it was colder. "You will be. But if you're really set on this path, I suppose I'll have to help you out. But be careful, Eliza. There are forces in play that you can't even begin to understand." Eliza's heart raced. The pieces were falling into place. Monroe was involved, but he was only one part of the puzzle. The real enemy was still out there, and they were more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "I'm not backing down," Eliza said, her voice hardening with resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes to bring this down." Monroe leaned in, his eyes locking onto hers. "Then you'll find out exactly how far this goes, and how deep you've already stepped into the belly of the beast." The tension from the conversation with Charles Monroe lingered long after Eliza left the restaurant. The man's cryptic words echoed in her mind, rattling her thoughts. "You'll find out exactly how far this goes, and how deep you've already stepped into the belly of the beast." What did he mean by that? Was it a warning? Or was he trying to intimidate her into backing down? But Eliza wasn't the type to be intimidated. She had already come too far, and the stakes were higher than ever. Monroe had confirmed what she already suspected. The people she was up against weren't just criminals. They were a force that ran through every layer of society. And that meant bringing them down wouldn't be easy. But Eliza was determined. The fight wasn't just hers anymore. It was for the people of Deadwood Ridge, for the land she loved, and for every town connected to this sprawling network of power and corruption. She drove through the night, the headlights cutting through the darkness as she made her way back to the ranch. The plan had started to come together. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still one thing missing. Who was really pulling the strings behind Crawford, behind Monroe, behind this entire operation? As she pulled into the driveway, Lena was waiting by the door, her arms crossed, her posture tense. She hadn't said much since their meeting with Monroe, but Eliza knew she was just as determined as she was. "Anything useful?" Lena asked as Eliza stepped out of the truck. "Monroe's involved, but he's just one cog in the machine," Eliza replied, frustration lacing her voice. "I'm not sure who's at the top, but Monroe made it clear we're dealing with forces far beyond what we imagined. He said we've already stepped too far into the belly of the beast." Lena's eyes narrowed. "What does that even mean? You think Monroe's part of a larger network? Or is he just trying to throw us off track?" Eliza rubbed her temples, trying to shake off the weight of the day. "I don't know. But whatever this is, it's much bigger than we thought. We're not just fighting for Deadwood Ridge anymore. We're up against a system that's been in place for years, maybe even decades." Lena's gaze hardened. "So, what's the plan now?" Eliza straightened, determination flaring in her chest. "We dig deeper. We find out who's behind Monroe, who's running this empire. And then we expose them. But we can't do it alone. We need to go outside of Deadwood Ridge. We need connections. People who know how to move through this world without being noticed. We're already on their radar," Lena said, her voice sharp. "But we've got one advantage. They think we're just some small-town rebels. They've underestimated us." Eliza nodded. "I've got an idea of where to start. We need to make contact with someone in the city. Someone who's been keeping an eye on the larger players. Someone who can help us get to the top." The next morning, Eliza was at the town hall, pacing back and forth. She had reached out to an old contact, an investigative journalist who had been working on stories about corruption in the region for years. His name was Ian Crowley. He had connections to people inside the system and knew how to dig without getting caught. But reaching him wasn't going to be easy. It had been years since they had last spoken. She sat down at the desk and typed out a message, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard as she outlined what had happened so far. Crawford's arrest, Monroe's involvement, the mysterious woman who had warned her. It all had to come together somehow. And Ian was the key to unlocking it. The phone rang, breaking her concentration. Eliza picked it up, her heart racing slightly. "Eliza," a voice said on the other end. It was familiar, gruff, yet comforting. "It's Ian. I hear you've been digging in some dangerous places." Eliza sat up straighter. "Ian, I'm glad you picked up. I need your help. I'm up against something big, something I don't fully understand yet. But I know it's bigger than Deadwood Ridge. I need information on a network of people who are controlling everything." Ian's voice was quiet for a moment, as if weighing her words. "You've been digging into Monroe's operation, haven't you?" "Yes," Eliza said, a sense of urgency in her voice. "But it's more than just him. I'm starting to think this goes all the way to the top, and I need to know who's pulling the strings. Can you help me?" "I've been keeping an eye on a few things, Eliza, but what you're talking about, it's dangerous. You're already playing with fire." "I know," Eliza replied, her voice steady, "but I don't have a choice." There was a long pause before Ian finally spoke again. "All right, I'll help you, but you need to meet me in person. There's a safe house I use when things get too hot. I'll give you the address. Come alone and come prepared." This is the kind of information that doesn't come without a price. Eliza's heart raced as she scribbled down the address. She knew this was the moment that could make or break everything. She had trusted Ian before, and now she was placing her life and the future of Deadwood Ridge in his hands. "I'll be there," Eliza said, her voice firm. "I'll bring Lena. We're in this together." Ian hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "You sure about that?" "This is going to get ugly, Eliza." "I'm sure," she replied, determination hardening in her voice. "I'm not backing down." Later that day, Eliza and Lena drove into the city, the streets growing busier as they approached the safe house Ian had described. It was a quiet, unassuming building in the middle of a residential area, far from the prying eyes of those who might be watching. They parked a few blocks away and walked in silence, their steps echoing on the pavement. The air was thick with tension, but neither of them said a word. They both knew what was at stake. They reached the building, and Eliza knocked twice on the door. A few moments later, Ian opened it, ushering them inside quickly. He led them to a small, dimly lit room in the back, where files and papers were scattered across a table. "Sit down," Ian said, motioning to the chairs. "I've got everything I could find, but I need to warn you, this is only the tip of the iceberg." Eliza and Lena took their seats, their eyes fixed on Ian as he began to speak. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to come together. The people behind Crawford's operation were far more dangerous than they had imagined. But with Ian's help, Eliza was closer than ever to exposing them all. "We need to take them down, Ian," Eliza said quietly, her voice filled with conviction. "We can't let them destroy this town. We'll do whatever it takes." Ian met her gaze, his eyes hard. "Then let's get started." The room was thick with tension as Eliza, Lena, and Ian pored over the piles of information spread out before them. The walls of the safe house felt like they were closing in, the weight of the mission pressing down on their shoulders. Ian's expertise and knowledge were invaluable, but Eliza knew the risk they were taking. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. "I've been digging into the people behind Monroe," Ian said, tapping a folder with his pen. "These aren't just criminals. They're powerful people, deeply entrenched in the political and economic systems. Crawford was a player, but the people pulling the strings are much more dangerous. This network reaches far beyond Deadwood Ridge." Eliza leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. "How far? What are we dealing with?" Ian flipped open the folder and began pointing to the names listed. "I've traced their connections. You've got business tycoons, law enforcement officials, even people with ties to high-ranking politicians. It's a carefully constructed web of power, money, and influence." Lena crossed her arms, her eyes scanning the list of names. "These people have been operating in the shadows for a long time. They've been untouchable." Eliza clenched her jaw, a surge of frustration rising within her. "Not for much longer. We have to expose them, tear this web apart." Ian glanced up from the papers, his eyes narrowing. "You're not just fighting criminals here, Eliza. You're fighting a system that's been built over decades. They have resources, connections. If you push too hard, they'll come after you. Hard." "I know the risks," Eliza replied, her voice firm, "but I'm not backing down. Deadwood Ridge is my home, and I'm not going to let these people take it. I'll do whatever it takes to stop them." Ian studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're sure about this? Because once you go down this path, there's no turning back." Lena's voice was quiet but unwavering. "We've already come too far to stop now." Ian let out a slow breath and nodded. "All right, but you're going to need more than just intel. You'll need leverage. People willing to testify. People on the inside who can bring this down from within. I've got a few contacts who might be able to help." Eliza's eyes hardened with resolve. "We don't have time to waste. We need those contacts, and we need them now." The following days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and covert operations. Eliza and Lena worked alongside Ian, pulling strings and contacting people who could help them infiltrate the network. It wasn't easy. Every door they knocked on seemed to lead to another wall. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the path became. But with Ian's connections, they managed to find someone willing to talk, an insider, someone with direct knowledge of the network's inner workings. Her name was Rachel, a former assistant to one of the powerful men involved in the operation. She had worked closely with the network for years, handling the paperwork, the money, the deals that kept everything running. And she had finally had enough. "She's scared," Ian said, his voice low as he relayed the information to Eliza and Lena. "She knows the risks of talking, but she's willing to help. She wants out." Eliza's eyes met Lena's. This was the break they needed. "When do we meet her?" Eliza asked, her voice steady. "Tomorrow," Ian replied. "I'll set it up. She's agreed to meet you in person, but she insists on a neutral location. She won't come to Deadwood Ridge, and we can't bring her here." It has to be discreet. The next day, Eliza and Lena made their way to the location Ian had arranged, a small, inconspicuous cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was the perfect place to meet someone who needed to remain unseen, and Eliza knew they couldn't afford to be careless. The stakes were higher than ever. They arrived early, sitting at a corner table, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of Rachel. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment that could shift everything. If Rachel could give them the information they needed, they would have the leverage to bring down the entire operation. But if they were wrong, if Rachel couldn't deliver, they would be back to square one, only with even more dangerous enemies on their trail. Minutes later, a woman walked in. Her eyes darted around the cafe nervously, but she quickly spotted Eliza and Lena and made her way over to their table. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair and a worried look on her face. She took a seat across from them without speaking, her gaze flicking nervously around the room. Eliza leaned in slightly, her voice soft but firm. "Rachel, we don't have much time. We need information, and we need it now." Rachel swallowed hard, her fingers twisting nervously around her coffee cup. I know what you're asking, but you have to understand, it's not easy. These people are dangerous. They've been running things for a long time, and if they know I'm talking..." "We understand the risks," Lena interrupted, her voice steady. "But if you don't talk, they'll just keep operating, and more people will suffer. This is your chance to get out, to stop them." Rachel looked down at her hands for a moment before meeting Eliza's gaze. "I've worked with them for years. I've seen how far they'll go to protect themselves. I've seen the deals, the cover-ups, the money flowing through the system like it's nothing. I know how they operate, how they control everything. And I know who's at the top." Eliza leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who? Tell me who's behind it all." Rachel's eyes flicked nervously around the cafe before she spoke in a voice barely audible. "It's William Crawford. But it's not just him. It's people much higher up, politicians, businessmen. It's a whole system. And the worst part? They've got people in law enforcement working for them. People who protect them, make sure nothing ever gets out." Eliza's pulse quickened. They were getting closer. "You're sure?" Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with fear. "I've seen the transactions. I've seen the names. But you need to be careful, Eliza. Once they know you're onto them, they won't stop until you're gone." Lena's voice was hard, determined. "We'll be ready." Rachel took a deep breath. "I've got a file. It's all there. Names, evidence, connections. But I can't just hand it over. If they find out I gave you this, I'm as good as dead." Eliza nodded. "We'll take it. But you need to leave town. Get as far away as you can. This won't be safe for you once we move forward." Rachel looked at them both, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. But she handed over a small, inconspicuous flash drive. "Here," Rachel said quietly, her voice shaking. "This is everything. It's all I have left." Eliza took the flash drive, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the key to bringing down the network. The pieces were finally falling into place. "Thank you, Rachel," Eliza said, her voice soft. "You've done the right thing." Rachel stood, her eyes scanning the room once more before she hurried out of the cafe, disappearing into the street. Eliza and Lena sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of what they now had settling over them. "This is it," Eliza said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "We bring this down. We bring them all down." Lena nodded, her eyes focused, her resolve as unwavering as Eliza's. "We finish this." With the evidence in their hands, they knew the final battle was ahead. But this time, it was personal. Deadwood Ridge would never be the same, and neither would they. The flash drive was a weighty thing, not because of its size, but because of what it represented. Inside, Eliza and Lena knew, lay the key to exposing the corrupt network that had been controlling Deadwood Ridge and beyond. They'd made it this far, dug deep, uncovered lies, and betrayed trust. But now, they had the most dangerous weapon they could ever hope for: proof. Solid, irrefutable proof that could bring everything down. They didn't waste time. Back at the safe house, they plugged the flash drive into a laptop and began scouring through the files Rachel had given them. It was all there. Names, dates, encrypted bank transactions, political connections, and even the high-ranking officials that had been keeping the operation running smoothly, all neatly documented. "This is everything," Eliza said quietly, her voice filled with awe and anger as she scrolled through the files. "They've been operating with impunity for years. And now we have them." Lena stood next to her, arms crossed, her expression hard. "We have the power to end this, to stop them all. But it's not going to be easy. We're still up against the whole damn system." Eliza nodded, feeling the gravity of the situation. This was bigger than just taking down Crawford or Monroe. This was about dismantling an empire, an invisible force that had its hands in every corner of power, the kind of corruption that could ruin lives with a whisper. "We can't just hand this over to the authorities," Eliza said, looking up at Lena. "We've got to make sure it gets into the right hands. We need allies who can get this out there, to the press, to the public. If we don't, they'll bury it, just like they've done with everything else." Lena didn't flinch. "We'll make sure it gets out. We'll expose them for what they really are." Eliza closed the laptop, her mind already running through the next steps. "But we need a plan. A way to make sure they can't come after us before we can get this information out. They've already warned me once. We need to hit them hard, fast, and leave no trace." The next few days were a blur of activity, the clock ticking louder with every passing hour. Eliza, Lena, and Ian worked in secret, making sure everything was lined up. The plan was risky. It involved getting the information to a trusted journalist who could release it to the public, while also making sure that the people behind the network, Carter, Monroe, and whoever else was involved, couldn't get their hands on the evidence. But there was no more room for error. They had been playing on the fringes for too long. Now, it was time to bring the fight to the heart of the beast. Eliza met with Ian one last time, in a secluded spot away from prying eyes. He had made contact with the journalist, someone who had the resources to break the story wide open, someone who had been following the corruption for years but had never had the smoking gun to expose it. "I'm ready to take it from here," Ian said, his eyes steady and serious. "But once this goes public, everything changes. They won't stop coming for you, Eliza. Not until they're sure you're gone." "I know," Eliza said, her voice cold with resolve. "But we can't let them win. We've already taken the first step. Now, we finish this." Ian gave a nod, his expression grim. "I'll make sure the journalist gets everything. You've done your part. It's time for me to do mine." Later that night, as the town settled into a deceptive quiet, Eliza and Lena gathered their things. They had done everything they could to cover their tracks, leaving no sign of their involvement. It was up to Ian now, up to the journalist. The next 24 hours would determine everything. But as Eliza drove through the empty streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't quite over. They had one more hurdle to clear, one last challenge before the truth could finally come to light. The phone rang, slicing through the stillness of the night. "Eliza." The voice on the other end was familiar, too familiar. It was Samuel Carter. "I told you once." Carter's voice was cold and steady. "You should have walked away when you had the chance. Now, I'm going to make sure your entire world crumbles. You've exposed my operation, and that's something I won't let go." Eliza's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't falter. "You're too late. You've already lost. The truth's out, Carter. It's over." The silence that followed was almost suffocating. Then, Carter spoke again, his voice laced with venom. "This isn't over, Eliza. It's only just begun. You think you're safe? You think you've won? You've made a powerful enemy, and I'll make sure you pay for this." The line went dead. Eliza's grip on the wheel tightened, but her expression remained unshaken. They had made it this far, but Carter was right about one thing. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. The next day, as the town prepared for a new dawn, the news hit the airwaves. The story that had been hidden for so long, hidden beneath layers of corruption, was out. The evidence Eliza, Lena, and Ian had worked tirelessly to uncover had been released to the public, and it was spreading like wildfire. Political leaders, business magnates, law enforcement officials, all had been exposed for their roles in the underground network. The public was in an uproar, demanding answers, demanding justice. But even as Eliza watched the news unfold, her phone buzzed again. A message from Ian. They know. They've already started making moves. They're not going down without a fight. Eliza looked at the message, her heart sinking. They had succeeded. The truth was out there. But now, they would have to face the final battle. It wouldn't be over until the entire operation was destroyed. The storm had finally arrived. But Eliza wasn't afraid. She had fought this fight too long and too hard to back down now. This was it. The final confrontation. That night, Eliza stood in the quiet of Deadwood Ridge, staring out over the town she had fought so hard to protect. She could feel the weight of everything on her shoulders, the lives lost, the secrets uncovered, and the battle that still lay ahead. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Lena stood beside her, their shoulders touching, both of them looking out over the town they had both given everything to protect. "We've come this far," Lena said quietly, "and we're not stopping." Eliza nodded, her gaze hardening with resolve. "No, we finished this. For Deadwood Ridge. For everyone they've hurt." And with that, they stepped into the night, ready for the final fight. The calm before the storm was over. The final pieces had been set into motion, and now there was no turning back. Eliza stood on the edge of Deadwood Ridge, her fists clenched at her sides, staring out into the distance as the early morning light bathed the land in an eerie, almost surreal glow. The news had broken, and the entire region was reeling. The corruption, the web of power that had kept everything running in the shadows, was finally exposed to the public. And now, all eyes were on her and the people who had helped her bring it all to light. But Eliza knew it wasn't over. The enemy, though shaken, was not defeated. And as much as the truth was out there, she and Lena both knew the forces behind this network wouldn't go down without one last, brutal fight. Carter's words had been clear. This isn't over. The people they had exposed were dangerous, powerful, and they weren't just going to let their empire crumble. They would come for them. They would come for Deadwood Ridge. The sound of footsteps behind her drew Eliza's attention. Lena walked up, her expression hard, her eyes unwavering. "This is it, isn't it?" Lena asked, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. Eliza nodded. "They won't stop. Not until they're sure we're finished." Lena glanced at the horizon, where the first signs of dawn's light were creeping up. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but we've come this far, and we've got each other." Eliza's throat tightened, and for a moment, she felt a rush of emotion. Gratitude, fear, and the overwhelming weight of the responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders. But she quickly pushed it down. She couldn't afford to let sentimentality distract her. "We've got the truth now," Eliza said, her voice steady. "We've exposed them, and we have people who are ready to fight. We're not alone in this." Lena placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder. "We take them down. All of them. For Deadwood Ridge. For everything they've tried to destroy." The words were a promise, a vow that would carry them through the darkest moments yet to come. Back at the safe house, things had started moving quickly. The news had rattled the network, but it had also spurred them into action. The phone calls, the meetings, the clandestine operations, they all intensified as the people behind Crawford, Monroe, and Carter scrambled to contain the fallout. But Eliza knew they wouldn't be able to contain it. The truth was too loud. It was too powerful. Ian had already made arrangements for backup. The right people, the right connections to ensure that once they brought the full force of the law down on the corrupt network, it couldn't be covered up or swept under the rug. But it was going to take more than just the authorities. The streets were alive with whispers, whispers of revolution, whispers of justice. The people of Deadwood Ridge were waking up, and Eliza had given them something they had never had before. "Hope. You ready for this?" Ian asked, stepping into the room with his usual gruff demeanor. Eliza met his eyes, feeling the weight of his gaze. "We don't have a choice." Ian grunted and sat down at the table, pulling out a map of the town. "I've got intel that the network is making moves. They're gathering their people. They're going to try to strike back before we can get the full support we need." Lena leaned in, her voice sharp. "Then we strike first. We've got the evidence. We've got leverage. It's time to take them down." Ian pointed to a few locations on the map. "This is where they're operating. The warehouse district on the north side, the old storage facility on the west. These are their main hubs, where they keep their operations running, and they'll be fortified, armed. But we've got the law on our side, and we've got the people. We just need to coordinate. Eliza's eyes burned with determination. This was the final push, the last chance to take down the heart of the operation and bring an end to their reign of power. But there was something else, something even more dangerous, that was still lurking in the shadows. Carter. The thought of him still sent a shiver down her spine. She knew he wouldn't go quietly. He had been the mastermind behind so much of this, and as much as she wanted to believe that the public exposure would bring it all to an end, she knew better. They were up against a beast that wouldn't die just because you cut off a few of its heads. Carter was still out there, still willing to do whatever it took to maintain control. "Do we have a plan for Carter?" Eliza asked, her voice firm. Ian's face darkened, his eyes narrowing as he placed his hands on the table. "He's been laying low, but we can't afford to let our guard down. He's got resources, connections, people who'll do anything for him. He's dangerous. He won't go down without a fight." Eliza clenched her fists, the anger rising in her chest. "Then we find him. We take him down too. This ends tonight." Lena met her gaze. "We can't leave him behind. Not after everything he's done." Ian nodded, his expression grim. "I've got a few contacts who are tracking his movements. We'll catch him before he can make a move. But you're right, this has to end tonight." As nightfall approached, the pieces of the plan began to fall into place. The authorities were ready. The journalists were ready. The people of Deadwood Ridge, emboldened by the truth, were ready to stand with them. This was it, the final stand. Eliza, Lena, and Ian gathered their things, each of them taking one last look at the map, making sure every angle was covered. They were going to hit the warehouse district first, cut off any escape routes, and then move to the storage facility where the final blow would land. "This is it," Eliza said, her voice low but filled with resolve. "We do this, and we end it once and for all." Lena nodded. "For Deadwood Ridge." Ian stood up, a determined look on his face. "Let's finish this." The operation unfolded with a swift precision. The authorities and their allies moved into position, blocking off the roads, securing key areas, and preparing to sweep through the warehouses and storage facilities where the corrupt network had been hiding its operations. But Eliza and Lena were the tip of the spear. They were leading the charge, walking headlong into the heart of the beast. The tension in the air was thick, but Eliza didn't feel fear. She felt the surge of adrenaline, the rush of knowing that this was the moment she had been waiting for. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. They reached the first warehouse in the district, moving quickly and silently. The plan was to take down the outer layer of security, sweep through the building, and capture whoever was inside. Eliza's heart was pounding in her chest as she crouched low behind a stack of crates, her eyes scanning the shadows. Lena was beside her, the same determined fire in her eyes. "Ready?" she whispered. Eliza nodded. "Let's do this." They burst into the building, moving quickly and efficiently. The sound of footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space, followed by the shouts of people trying to react to the intrusion. But it was too late. The team they had brought in quickly neutralized the remaining threats, and soon the warehouse was secured. "This is just the beginning," Eliza muttered to herself. They had struck first, but Carter was still out there. The final piece was still missing. As they moved toward the final facility, Eliza's phone buzzed with a message from Ian. She read it quickly. "Carter's on the move. He's headed toward the south side. I'm on him. You need to get to the storage facility now." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. The final confrontation was closer than she had realized. Carter had made a move, and it was now or never. "Let's go," Eliza said, her voice sharp. "We're going after him." They rushed toward the storage facility, their steps quick but calculated. When they arrived, Eliza took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about stopping a network of criminals. It was about putting an end to the nightmare that had been haunting Deadwood Ridge. The doors to the storage facility were locked, but that was never a problem. Eliza had learned to adapt, to find a way through every obstacle. Within moments, they were inside. The building was eerily quiet, but Eliza could feel the danger lurking in the shadows. They moved carefully, step by step, their eyes scanning every corner, every doorway. And then, there he was, Carter, standing in the middle of the room, facing them. His eyes were cold, calculating, but there was no fear in them, only the cold certainty that he still had the upper hand. "You shouldn't have come here, Eliza," Carter said, his voice low, almost mocking. "You've already exposed the network, but you're too late to stop it. Too late to save your precious town." Eliza's grip on her weapon tightened. "It's over, Carter. You've lost." Carter laughed, a low, sinister sound that echoed off the walls. "You think you've won? This isn't just about Deadwood Ridge, Eliza. You've made powerful enemies. Enemies who will stop at nothing to make sure this doesn't get out." The door slammed shut behind them. Carter's laugh turned to a grimace. "You're surrounded." Eliza turned toward Lena, exchanging a quick glance. They were trapped, but they weren't giving up. Not now. A fight broke out, swift and brutal. Carter had a few of his men hidden in the shadows, but they weren't ready for the ferocity with which Eliza and Lena fought. Every move was calculated, every punch thrown with purpose. In the end, it was Carter who fell. But not before he whispered one last thing, a warning. "You don't understand. It's never over." As the authorities arrived to take Carter into custody, Eliza and Lena stood over him, breathing heavily, their bodies sore from the fight. But the victory was theirs. They had exposed the truth. They had destroyed the empire that had been built in the shadows. The fight was over. The town was safe. And Deadwood Ridge would finally have the peace it had been robbed of for so long. Eliza turned to Lena, her face hard but filled with relief. "We did it." Lena smiled, though there was still a certain weight in her eyes. "We did." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Eliza allowed herself to believe it. The fight was over. Deadwood Ridge was free. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.